consciousness is a prison that thinks it's a palace. Consciousness is often praised as the highest gift of existence, the trait that elevates humans above instinct and grants depth, creativity, and selfhood. Yet this same consciousness quietly confines. It surrounds the mind with constant awareness of time passing, of identity, of fear, of mortality, while convincing itself that this heightened perception is freedom. The walls are invisible, which makes them easy to mistake for open space. Within consciousness, every experience is filtered through interpretation. Nothing is simply lived. Everything is analyzed, remembered, compared, and anticipated. Joy is interrupted by the fear of losing it. Pain is prolonged by replay and anticipation. Even neutral moments are rarely allowed to remain neutral. Consciousness turns life into a continuous internal commentary, and that commentary never sleeps. The palace feels grand because it is richly furnished with thoughts, emotions, and meaning, but the door is always locked from the inside. What makes this prison effective is its illusion of luxury. Consciousness offers imagination, reflection, and identity, making it feel like a gift rather than a confinement. The mind decorates the walls with beliefs, goals, and narratives, mistaking decoration for freedom. Yet there is no true exit from constant self-awareness. You cannot step outside yourself, only rearrange how the space feels. Instinctual creatures move, rest, fear, and desire without questioning the process. Consciousness removes that simplicity and replaces it with interpretation. Every choice becomes a statement about who you are. Every mistake becomes a story. Every future moment becomes a calculation. The tragedy is not that consciousness traps you, but that it convinces you the bars are chandeliers. You admire the structure, defend it, and protect it, never realizing that the very thing you celebrate is what keeps you pacing inside your own mind. The brain prefers familiar suffering to unfamiliar peace. The brain is not designed to seek happiness. It is designed to seek predictability. Familiar suffering, no matter how painful, offers a sense of control because it is known territory. The patterns are recognizable, the outcomes expected, and the emotional costs already calculated. Unfamiliar peace, by contrast, is uncertain. It lacks reference points, routines, and guarantees. To the brain, uncertainty signals danger, even when the alternative is relief. This is why people return to the same destructive relationships, habits, and thought loops. The suffering may hurt, but it feels navigable. The brain knows how to survive it. Peace requires change, and change forces the brain to abandon scripts that once kept it safe. Even if those scripts now cause harm, they are trusted because they are proven. Familiar pain becomes a warped form of security. Unfamiliar peace also threatens identity. When suffering has been present for a long time, it becomes integrated into how a person understands themselves. Struggle turns into personality. Letting go of pain means letting go of the story built around endurance, resilience, and survival. The brain resists this loss, not because peace is undesirable, but because it dismantles what has been used to define the self. There is also the fear of disappointment. Choosing peace introduces the risk that it might not last. The brain anticipates the fall before the calm, preferring pain it can brace for over peace it cannot predict. In this way, suffering feels honest, while peace feels suspicious. The tragedy is that the brain mistakes comfort with safety. It keeps returning to what hurts because it knows the shape of the wound. Peace demands vulnerability, presence, and trust in the unknown. To a brain trained by survival, that feels far more dangerous than pain it already understands. Truth is rarely hidden. It's simply unbearable. People often believe truth is difficult to find, buried beneath lies, deception, or complexity. In reality, most truths sit in plain sight, quietly ignored rather than actively concealed. They don't disappear because they are unknown. They disappear because acknowledging them would demand an internal collapse. Truth is avoided not out of ignorance, but out of self-preservation. Unbearable truths threaten identity. They challenge the stories people tell themselves about who they are, why they act the way they do, and what their future promises. To accept certain truths would mean admitting that effort didn't guarantee reward, that love didn't ensure permanence, that intention didn't prevent harm. These realizations don't just inform, they destabilize. The mind resists anything that might dismantle the framework keeping it functional. Truth also strips away comfort. It removes the illusion that things will eventually make sense or align neatly. It exposes randomness, limitation, and personal responsibility in ways that leave no room for excuses. Knowing the truth about a relationship, a belief, or oneself often brings more pain than not knowing. This makes denial feel like wisdom and avoidance feel like intelligence. The unbearable nature of truth lies in its permanence. Once seen, it cannot be reshaped to fit desire. It doesn't argue or soften itself. It simply exists, indifferent to emotional readiness. This is why people reinterpret truth, dilute it, or surround it with noise, not to deceive others, but to protect themselves from its weight. Truth doesn't hide behind walls. It stands openly, waiting for someone willing to endure the consequences of seeing it clearly. Most people don't lack access to truth. They lack the capacity to sit with the discomfort it brings without immediately reaching for something that makes it easier to bear. Awareness is often sold as liberation, as if simply seeing reality clearly will dissolve suffering and grant control. In truth, awareness rarely breaks the cage. It only turns the lights on. The moment you become aware, you don't escape. You notice. You see the patterns governing your behavior, the fears steering your decisions, the habits repeating themselves despite your best intentions. And once seen, they cannot be unseen. Before awareness, ignorance acts as a sedative. You move through life believing your thoughts are chosen, your reactions justified, your limits external. Awareness removes that comfort. It reveals how much of your life runs on automatic scripts written long before you question them. You realize how often you act from fear while calling it logic, from conditioning while calling it choice. This realization doesn't immediately empower you, it weighs you down. The cruel part is that awareness creates responsibility without instantly granting control. You know why you spiral, yet you still spiral. You recognize the thought loop forming, yet it closes around you anyway. This creates a unique kind of suffering, the pain of understanding paired with the frustration of repetition. The bars aren't new. What's new is your ability to see how solid they are. Awareness sharpens discomfort because it strips away excuses. You can no longer blame the world without also seeing your participation in it. You can't hide behind ignorance once you understand the mechanism. Freedom, if it ever comes, is not a gift of awareness, but a long negotiation with it. Awareness is not the key. It is the map of the prison, drawn in brutal detail, forcing you to sit with the truth that seeing is not the same as escaping. Meaning is something humans invent, so silence doesn't feel so loud. Meaning exists less as a discovery and more as a defense mechanism. When humans look into the vastness of existence, what confronts them first is not purpose, but silence, an unresponsive universe that offers no explanations, no reassurance, no inherent direction. Meaning is created to soften that confrontation. It fills the empty space where answers never arrive. Without it, silence becomes unbearable, pressing in on the mind with questions that have no voice replying back. From childhood, humans are taught narratives to protect them from this void. Stories about destiny, purpose, success, morality, and progress give shape to an otherwise indifferent reality. These ideas are not meaningless, but they are constructed. They exist to prevent the mind from collapsing under the weight of randomness. Meaning provides structure where none is guaranteed. It turns chaos into something that feels survivable. The mind struggles with silence because silence implies nothing is watching, nothing is guiding, and nothing is owed. In that quiet, thoughts echo louder, doubts multiply, and the illusion of control weakens. Meaning becomes a psychological anchor. It gives suffering a reason, effort a reward, and existence a narrative arc. Without it, pain feels arbitrary and joy feels fleeting, which terrifies the thinking mind. Yet the louder the silence beneath life, the more desperately meaning is layered on top. Careers become identities, relationships become proofs, beliefs become shields. Not because they are inherently false, but because they protect against the terrifying possibility that nothing explains itself. Meaning doesn't erase silence. It simply talks over it, just enough to let humans keep moving forward without stopping long enough to hear how quiet existence truly is. The mind questions everything except its own need to question. The mind prides itself on skepticism. It dissects beliefs, challenges assumptions, and searches relentlessly for flaws in ideas, systems, and people. Questioning becomes its badge of intelligence, proof that it is awake and not easily fooled. Yet buried beneath this constant interrogation is an assumption so deeply embedded that it goes unnoticed. The belief that questioning itself is necessary, virtuous, and always useful. Rarely does the mind pause to ask why it needs to question in the first place. The impulse feels automatic, as if curiosity were a moral obligation rather than a habit. Thoughts arise demanding answers, clarity, certainty, and resolution, and the mind obeys without hesitation. It treats unanswered questions as threats, loops to be closed, problems to be solved. In doing so, it never questions whether this constant probing is serving understanding or merely feeding anxiety. Questioning gives the illusion of control. As long as the mind is analyzing, it feels active, protected from uncertainty. Silence feels dangerous because silence offers no leverage. When the mind questions, it feels alive and relevant. It believes that if it stops asking, something will go wrong, something will be missed, or something important will collapse. This fear keeps the questioning alive long after it has stopped producing insight. What goes unnoticed is that questioning can become self-sustaining. The mind questions because it is conditioned to believe that unexamined moments are wasted moments. Yet some truths dissolve when chased too aggressively, and some understanding only appears when the interrogation ends. The mind resists questioning its own compulsion because doing so threatens its role as the central authority, forcing it to confront the possibility that not every moment requires explanation to be valid. Overthinking is intelligence with nowhere safe to land. Overthinking is often mistaken for weakness, indecision, or emotional instability, but at its core, it is excess intelligence trapped in an unsafe environment. The mind is capable of depth, pattern recognition, and anticipation. Yet, when there is no stable place for those abilities to rest, they turn inward and begin to spiral. Overthinking is not a lack of thinking skill, but a surplus with no outlet that feels secure. An intelligent mind sees multiple possibilities at once. It notices consequences before actions are taken, contradictions before beliefs settle, and flaws before comfort forms. When the world does not provide certainty, reassurance, or emotional safety, the mind keeps scanning. It replays conversations, simulates futures, and dissects past decisions, hoping to find solid ground. Each thought promises resolution, but none provide it, so the loop continues. What makes overthinking painful is not the complexity of the thoughts, but the absence of trust. trust in outcomes, in people, in oneself, or in reality itself. Without trust, intelligence becomes hypervigilant. The mind treats uncertainty as danger and analysis as protection. It believes that if it thinks hard enough, it can prevent pain, embarrassment, or loss. Instead, it creates a constant state of mental tension. There is no safe landing because certainty is never achieved. Every answer opens another question. Every decision reveals an alternative path. Every insight exposes a deeper layer. The mind never rests because rest feels irresponsible. Overthinking is intelligence stuck in midair, circling endlessly, afraid to land because landing means choosing, and choosing means accepting the possibility of being wrong. The exhaustion comes not from thinking too much, but from never feeling allowed to stop. Hope is the most elegant form of denial. Hope presents itself as light, as strength, as the reason people endure what would otherwise crush them. It feels noble, necessary, even heroic. Yet beneath its comforting surface, hope often functions as a refined refusal to fully accept what is happening now. It redirects attention away from reality and places it into an imagined future where things resolve, improve, or make sense. In doing so, it softens pain, but it also delays confrontation. The mind uses hope to survive discomfort without having to sit inside it completely. When circumstances feel unbearable, hope whispers that endurance will be rewarded later. This promise makes suffering tolerable, not because it changes reality, but because it postpones emotional reckoning. The present moment becomes something to escape rather than inhabit. Pain is reframed as temporary, even when there is no evidence that it is. Hope is elegant because it doesn't feel like denial. It feels like optimism, resilience, and faith. Unlike blunt avoidance, it doesn't reject reality outright. It simply edits it, removing the finality, uncertainty, and permanence that make acceptance difficult. The mind tells itself a different ending is coming, which allows it to avoid fully grieving the current one. This becomes dangerous when hope replaces honesty. When people cling to hope, they may ignore patterns, excuse harm, or delay necessary change. Hope can keep people loyal to broken systems, relationships, and identities long after evidence suggests otherwise. Letting go of hope feels like surrender, but it is often the first moment of clarity. Without hope cushioning the truth, reality arrives unfiltered, and that rawness is terrifying, not because it destroys you, but because it leaves nothing left to lean on except what already is. The self is a story told too often to forget it's fiction. The self feels solid because it is repeated. Day after day, the mind narrates experiences, reactions, and memories into a coherent character, slowly convincing itself that this character is real. I am this way. I've always been like this. This is who I am. Over time, repetition hardens into identity. What began as interpretation becomes treated as fact. This story is built from selective memory. Certain moments are highlighted, others discarded, all arranged to maintain consistency. Contradictions are explained away, growth is reframed as continuity, and change is softened into familiarity. The mind does this not to deceive maliciously, but to survive. A stable self provides predictability. Without it, existence would feel fragmented and unsafe. The danger arises when the story becomes unquestionable. The self stops being a tool for navigation and turns into a prison of expectation. Choices are filtered through past labels. Reactions are justified because that's just how I am. The fiction begins to dictate behavior rather than describe it. At that point, the narrative is no longer serving understanding. It is enforcing inertia. What makes the illusion powerful is emotional investment. The self carries pride, shame, regret, and hope. To question it feels like erasing oneself. So the mind defends the story fiercely, even when it causes suffering. It would rather maintain a familiar identity than risk the uncertainty of not knowing who it is. Occasionally, cracks appear. In moments of silence, shock, or deep change, the narrative falters and the self feels strangely absent. These moments are unsettling but revealing. They hint that what feels permanent is actually constructed. Yet the story quickly resumes, told again and again, until the fiction feels more real than the quiet awareness beneath it. Freedom terrifies people more than control ever could. Freedom is often imagined as relief, as open space and unlimited possibility. But to the human mind, it feels more like exposure. True freedom removes structure, removes instructions, and removes the ability to blame. When there is no authority to follow and no system to hide behind, every choice becomes personal and every outcome feels deserved. This level of responsibility is deeply unsettling. Control, even when oppressive, offers predictability. It tells people where the lines are, what is expected, and how to survive within a defined framework. In controlled environments, pain feels justified because it has a cause outside the self. Someone else is responsible. Freedom erases that comfort. It offers no guarantees, no reassurance that effort will be rewarded or that mistakes will be forgiven. The absence of boundaries forces the individual to confront uncertainty without protection. Freedom also demands self-definition. Without external rules, people must decide who they are, what they value, and how they will live. This decision-making never ends. Each moment becomes a reflection of character, and many people are not prepared to face themselves that directly. Control, by contrast, allows identity to be borrowed. Roles replace authenticity, and obedience replaces introspection. The fear of freedom is the fear of standing alone with consequences. It is easier to resent control than to face the anxiety of limitless choice. This is why people willingly submit to routines, beliefs, systems, and relationships that restrict them. They trade possibility for certainty, depth for safety. Freedom doesn't promise happiness, it demands courage. And for many, the weight of that demand feels far heavier than the chains they already know. Most beliefs are habits with better marketing. Beliefs often present themselves as carefully chosen truths, formed through logic, evidence, and personal insight. In reality, most beliefs begin as repeated exposure rather than deliberate reasoning. They are absorbed through culture, family, authority, and environment long before they are questioned. Over time, repetition turns familiarity into certainty, and certainty disguises itself as conviction. A belief feels solid not because it has been tested, but because it has been rehearsed. The mind grows comfortable with ideas it encounters often, mistaking frequency for validity. Language reinforces this comfort. Stories, slogans, traditions, and moral frameworks package beliefs in emotionally appealing ways, making them easier to adopt and harder to challenge. This is where marketing enters, not in the commercial sense alone, but in the emotional framing that makes ideas feel natural and unquestionable. Once installed, beliefs function like habits. They guide reactions, shape judgments, and filter perception automatically. The mind no longer asks whether a belief is true. It asks how to defend it. Contradictory information feels like a threat, not an invitation to re-examine. This is why beliefs persist even when evidence erodes them. Letting go would require unlearning, and unlearning disrupts identity and comfort. The strength of a belief is often proportional to how early it was learned and how socially rewarded it is. The more a belief is reinforced by belonging, approval, or safety, the more deeply it embeds itself. What appears as deep conviction is often just repetition protected by emotion. Beliefs survive not because they are accurate, but because they are convenient. They simplify reality, reduce uncertainty, and spare the mind from constant reevaluation. In this way, beliefs become mental shortcuts dressed up as truths, maintained less by logic and more by habit and the stories that keep them attractive enough to preserve. Memory exists to remind you that change is irreversible. Memory is often described as a tool for learning, nostalgia, and identity, but at its core, it serves a harsher function. It is a record of what can no longer be accessed. Every memory is proof that a moment has passed and cannot be re-entered in its original form. The mind does not preserve experiences to relive them, but to mark the distance between then and now. Memory makes time tangible by showing what has been lost to it. Change becomes undeniable through memory. Without it, transformation would feel seamless, almost invisible. Memory interrupts that illusion. It replays versions of yourself that no longer exist, choices that can't be undone, relationships that shifted or vanished. Even pleasant memories carry a quiet grief because they confirm that the conditions that created them are gone. The mind revisits them not to return, but to measure how far it has moved. This is why memory can feel heavy rather than comforting. It reminds you that growth has a cost, that innocence expires, and that every decision closes more doors than it opens. You cannot step back into an old belief with the same sincerity, nor feel a past emotion without the awareness of its ending. Memory ensures that change is not just experienced, but understood as permanent. The mind uses memory to anchor identity, yet that anchor cuts. You remember who you were to recognize who you are not anymore. Regret, nostalgia, and longing all stem from this function. Memory refuses to let transformation feel clean. It insists that every evolution leaves something behind, and that nothing truly returns untouched. In this way, memory doesn't preserve the past. It seals it, reminding you that time only moves forward and never negotiates. The universe doesn't judge. You do that part yourself. The universe operates without opinion. Events unfold, bodies move, systems collide, and time advances without commentary. There is no inherent verdict attached to success or failure, no moral reaction to pain or pleasure. What feels like judgment is not coming from existence itself, but from the mind interpreting what happens within it. The weight you feel after a mistake, the pride after an achievement, the shame attached to memory, all of it is internally generated. From early on, humans learn to label experience: good, bad, right, wrong, worthy, unworthy. These judgments create structure, but they also create suffering. The universe simply presents circumstances. The mind turns them into stories about what they mean for your value. A setback becomes a personal flaw. A rejection becomes proof of inadequacy. These interpretations feel objective because they arrive automatically, but they are learned responses, not universal truths. Judgment gives the illusion of control. By evaluating everything, the mind believes it can prevent future pain. If you judge yourself harshly enough, maybe you'll avoid repeating the mistake. If you anticipate judgment from others, maybe you can protect yourself. But this constant internal court never rests. Every action is reviewed, every thought evaluated, every emotion questioned. There is no acquittal, only temporary relief. What makes this exhausting is the false belief that the universe is watching, keeping score. In reality, existence is indifferent. Pain happens without meaning, and joy appears without justification. The universe does not demand perfection, consistency, or redemption. Those pressures come from the mind trying to impose order on randomness. You are not weighed by reality itself, only by the standards you carry inside. And because they are internal, they follow you everywhere, louder than any external consequence. Identity is just repetition mistaken for essence. What people call identity often feels solid and personal, as if it were an inner core discovered rather than constructed. In reality, identity forms through repetition. Thoughts repeated become beliefs, behaviors repeated become habits, and habits repeated long enough begin to feel like truth. Over time, these patterns harden, and the mind mistakes familiarity for essence. From an early age, certain traits are rewarded and others discouraged. The mind learns which versions of itself are accepted and which are rejected. It repeats what works. Preferences, reactions, opinions, and emotional responses are reinforced through memory and feedback until they feel inherent. Eventually, the pattern becomes self-defining. "This is who I am" replaces "this is what I've done" repeatedly. The danger of identity lies in how convincingly it limits possibility. Once a pattern is labeled as identity, change feels like betrayal rather than evolution. New behaviors feel inauthentic, not because they are false, but because they are unfamiliar. The mind protects identity fiercely, even when it causes suffering, because losing it feels like losing existence itself. Identity also creates predictability, which the mind craves. It allows future behavior to feel known, reducing uncertainty. But this predictability comes at a cost. Repetition narrows perception. You begin responding to life through reflex instead of presence. Experiences are filtered through who you believe you are rather than what is actually happening. What feels like essence is often just momentum. The self is less a fixed truth and more a pattern in motion, reinforced by memory and expectation. Recognizing this can feel destabilizing because it loosens the ground beneath certainty. If identity is repetition, then change is not the loss of self, but the interruption of a loop the mind had grown comfortable calling home. The mind creates problems to justify its existence. The mind does not exist in silence. It exists in activity. When there is nothing to solve, nothing to analyze, nothing to worry about, the mind begins to feel unnecessary. To avoid this threat, it manufactures problems. Not always real ones, but convincing ones. Questions without urgency become emergencies. Minor discomforts become crises. Neutral moments become puzzles demanding interpretation. Problem creation gives the mind a role. As long as there is something wrong, the mind can claim relevance. It becomes the protector, the planner, the fixer. Without problems, it would be forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. That much of life unfolds without needing constant commentary. This is why peace often feels suspicious. Calm is interpreted as stagnation. Stillness feels like danger because it leaves the mind without a task. The mind also equates value with effort. If something feels easy, it assumes something is being missed. If happiness arrives without struggle, it questions its legitimacy. Problems restore a sense of control. They give the illusion that suffering is productive, that anxiety is preparation, that overanalysis is responsibility. The mind convinces itself that constant engagement is necessary for survival, even when no threat exists. This is why solutions rarely end mental unrest. Solve one problem and another quietly takes its place. The satisfaction is brief because the real function was never resolution, but occupation. The mind is less interested in peace than in purpose, and problems provide that purpose effortlessly. What remains unseen is that the mind does not need problems to exist. It only believes it does. This belief keeps it active, noisy, and central. Letting go of unnecessary problems feels like erasure to the mind, as if silence might expose its fragility. So it keeps generating friction, not because life demands it, but because without problems, the mind would have to sit quietly and face the possibility that it was never required to work this hard to justify being there. Clarity often arrives too late to be useful. Clarity has a cruel sense of timing. It rarely appears when decisions are still open or when consequences can be avoided. Instead, it tends to arrive after the choice has been made, the damage done, or the moment has passed beyond repair. The mind finally understands what was happening only once there is nothing left to do but accept it. Insight follows action, not the other way around. In the moment, the mind is clouded by emotion, urgency, fear, and desire. It justifies, rationalizes, and commits before fully seeing. Only distance brings perspective. Once the noise fades, patterns become obvious. Red flags look unmistakable. Motivations appear transparent. The irony is painful. The understanding you needed most is now informational rather than functional. It explains, but it cannot intervene. This delayed clarity creates a specific kind of regret. You replay moments knowing exactly what should have been said, chosen, or avoided. The mind reconstructs the situation with perfect logic, forgetting that this clarity was unavailable at the time. This illusion makes past mistakes feel stupid rather than human. You judge your former self with knowledge it could not yet access. Clarity's lateness is not accidental. It requires emotional distance, and emotional distance usually comes only after loss, failure, or exhaustion. The mind learns by consequence, not foresight. Understanding is often the price paid for experience, not the tool that prevents it. This is why advice rarely works the way suffering does. You can hear the truth and still not see it. Clarity demands lived context, and by the time it arrives, its role has shifted. It no longer guides your actions. It reshapes your memory, forcing you to carry the lesson forward without giving you the chance to apply it where it mattered most. Desire isn't wanting, it's refusing the present moment. Desire is often mistaken for motivation, ambition, or passion. But at its core, it is a quiet rejection of what already exists. The moment desire arises, the present is judged as insufficient. Something else is imagined as better, necessary, or more complete, and the mind leans toward that imagined future while subtly turning away from now. Wanting is not the problem. The resistance embedded within it is. The mind uses desire to escape discomfort. If the present feels empty, painful, or dull, desire offers a mental exit. It promises relief just beyond reach, a version of life that will finally feel right. This promise keeps attention elsewhere. Even pleasurable desires operate this way. They pull awareness forward, teaching the mind that satisfaction is always slightly delayed. The present becomes a waiting room rather than a place to inhabit. What makes desire powerful is its emotional charge. It convinces you that fulfillment depends on acquisition, achievement, or change. Yet when the desired object is reached, the relief is brief. The mind quickly adjusts, scans for the next absence, and resumes its refusal of what is. Desire doesn't end with fulfillment because its source is not lack of objects, but discomfort with stillness. This creates a subtle form of suffering. Life is lived in anticipation rather than presence. Moments are evaluated based on how close they bring you to something else. Even success can feel hollow because the habit of refusal remains intact. The mind doesn't know how to rest inside completion. Desire persists because it feels productive. It gives direction and momentum. But beneath that movement is a tension, a quiet dissatisfaction with the current moment as it is. The tragedy is not that desire exists, but that it teaches the mind to overlook the only moment that is ever actually available. The search for purpose assumes there was an intention. The desire for purpose begins with a quiet assumption that life was meant to point somewhere. When people search for purpose, they are not just asking what to do, they are asking what they were designed for. Beneath the question lives an expectation of intention, as if existence arrived with a plan that has yet to be discovered. This assumption feels natural, but it is never proven. It is inherited. The mind struggles with the idea that things can exist without reason. Randomness feels hostile, almost insulting. Purpose comforts by implying order, direction, and justification. If there is a purpose, then suffering can be reframed as necessary, confusion as temporary, and effort as meaningful. The search itself becomes a way to avoid confronting the possibility that nothing is guiding the process. Purpose also relieves responsibility. If life has an intention, then fulfillment is about alignment rather than creation. You are not inventing meaning, you are uncovering it. This makes failure feel less personal and success feel more legitimate. Without intention, however, meaning becomes something you must actively choose, revise, and defend, and that level of authorship can feel overwhelming. The danger of searching for purpose is not disappointment, but dependency. The longer the mind waits for meaning to be revealed, the more it postpones living fully in the present. Life becomes preparation for a revelation that may never come. Moments are evaluated not for what they are, but for how useful they might be in fulfilling an imagined destiny. The search for purpose keeps the mind oriented toward the future, scanning for confirmation that existence makes sense. But this search rests on the belief that life owes coherence. When that belief is questioned, the search itself begins to feel fragile, as if the question was never about purpose at all, but about the fear of standing inside an existence that never promised one. Thinking deeply doesn't make life heavier. It reveals the weight that was always there. Deep thinking is often blamed for sorrow, as if reflection itself creates heaviness. In reality, depth does not add weight to life. It removes the numbness that kept that weight unnoticed. Before thinking deeply, life feels lighter, not because it is simple, but because much of it is ignored. Superficial understanding acts as insulation, dulling awareness of complexity, contradiction, and consequence. When that insulation thins, the weight was never created. It is finally felt. Deep thought slows perception. It stretches moments long enough for hidden layers to surface. The fragility of relationships, the uncertainty beneath plans, the randomness beneath effort all become visible. This visibility feels burdensome, but only because it contrasts with the earlier illusion of ease. The mind realizes how much is at stake in ordinary decisions, how little control exists beneath confidence, and how temporary stability really is. What makes this realization painful is that depth removes denial. Simple narratives no longer hold. Comforting explanations fracture under scrutiny. You begin to notice how much suffering is normalized, how much meaning is constructed, and how much of life operates without guarantees. This awareness doesn't crush you, it simply stops pretending on your behalf. The mind often wishes it could return to ignorance, mistaking lightness for happiness. But ignorance was never freedom, it was unawareness. The heaviness you feel after thinking deeply is not a punishment for intelligence, but the cost of clarity. Life has always carried this weight. Bills were always due, time was always passing, and loss was always possible. Deep thinking doesn't make life darker. It turns on the lights and forces you to acknowledge how much was already resting on your shoulders before you ever chose to look. Loneliness is understanding something no one asked to hear. Loneliness is often mistaken for the absence of people, but its deeper form appears in the presence of others. It emerges when your inner understanding drifts beyond what the surrounding world is willing to acknowledge. You see patterns, truths, or contradictions that don't fit comfortably into casual conversation, shared optimism, or social rituals. The isolation comes not from being unheard, but from realizing that being heard would change nothing. Understanding creates distance. The more clearly you see how people protect their beliefs, avoid discomfort, or repeat cycles, the harder it becomes to participate without friction. You recognize the scripts playing out beneath interactions, the unspoken fears driving decisions, and the compromises made for emotional safety. Speaking these observations feels intrusive, even cruel, because no one invited the mirror. So you remain silent, carrying insights that have nowhere to land. This form of loneliness is quiet and persistent. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic absence, but with restraint. You learn when to withhold, when to nod, when to simplify yourself so others feel at ease. Over time, this self-editing creates separation. You are present, yet not fully expressed, connected, yet internally solitary. The pain intensifies because understanding does not feel optional. Once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. But insight does not guarantee companionship. In fact, it often erodes it. Most people seek affirmation, not examination. They want comfort, not clarity. When your awareness outpaces the emotional readiness of those around you, you become alone inside shared spaces. Loneliness, then, is not about lacking connection, but about carrying perceptions that disrupt connection. It is the weight of seeing too much in a world that survives by seeing just enough. Logic doesn't protect you from pain. It explains why it's unavoidable. Logic is often treated as armor. People turn to it believing that if they can understand something well enough, analyze it deeply enough, or frame it rationally enough, the pain attached to it will lose its power. Logic promises distance, clarity, and control. But pain is not impressed by explanations. It doesn't disappear when understood. It simply becomes articulated. What logic actually does is remove illusion. It strips away false hope that suffering is accidental, unfair in a fixable way, or unique enough to be avoided next time. Logic shows patterns. It explains cause and effect, probability, limitation, and inevitability. In doing so, it often makes pain heavier, not lighter. You don't just hurt. You know exactly why you hurt, and why it makes sense that you do. This awareness creates a different kind of suffering. Emotional pain feels chaotic, but logical pain feels clean and inescapable. There is no one to blame, no mystery to solve, no loophole left open. Logic tells you that loss is built into attachment, that disappointment is embedded in expectation, that uncertainty is a permanent condition of being alive. Once seen, these truths cannot be argued away. People cling to logic because it offers dignity in suffering. If pain is unavoidable, at least it can be understood. But understanding does not equal immunity. The body still reacts, the heart still tightens, the mind still feels the weight, even while explaining it in perfect sentences. Logic doesn't rescue you from pain, because pain was never a misunderstanding. It is a consequence of being conscious, invested, and alive. Logic simply removes the fantasy that there is a safe path around it. What remains is not comfort, but clarity. The knowledge that suffering isn't a failure of thinking, but the cost of caring in a reality that makes no exceptions. Certainty is intellectual laziness in a confident voice. Certainty feels powerful because it ends discomfort. The moment the mind decides it knows, questioning stops, doubt quiets, and anxiety recedes. This relief is addictive. Certainty doesn't need to be correct to feel satisfying. It only needs to be firm. Confidence fills the gaps where understanding should be. The mind gravitates towards certainty not because it is accurate, but because it is efficient. Questioning requires effort, humility, and tolerance for ambiguity. Certainty shortcuts that process. It replaces investigation with conclusion and replaces curiosity with conviction. The more complex a reality feels, the more appealing certainty becomes. What makes certainty dangerous is how convincingly it masquerades as wisdom. Spoken confidently, even shallow conclusions sound profound. The mind mistakes decisiveness for depth. Over time, certainty becomes identity, and defending it becomes emotional rather than logical. Evidence that threatens certainty feels like a personal attack. Certainty also freezes learning. Once the mind decides it already knows, new information becomes irrelevant or threatening. Growth slows, not because there is nothing left to learn, but because learning would require admitting past conclusions were incomplete. True understanding remains flexible. It tolerates contradiction and uncertainty without rushing to resolve them. Certainty rejects this discomfort outright. It is not the product of deep thinking, but the avoidance of it, an intellectual resting position delivered with enough confidence to appear unshakable. Time doesn't heal, it distracts. Time is often credited with repairing wounds, as if suffering naturally dissolves if left alone long enough. In reality, time rarely heals anything. It simply introduces distance. What fades is not the pain itself, but the mind's ability to stay focused on it without interruption. New experiences, responsibilities, and routines pile on top of unresolved wounds, pushing them out of immediate awareness rather than removing them. Pain loses its sharpness because attention moves elsewhere. The mind becomes occupied with survival, distraction, and novelty. Memories that once felt unbearable are no longer constantly accessed, not because they were resolved, but because the present demands space. Time gives the illusion of healing by overwhelming the nervous system with new stimuli. The wound is still there, just no longer being touched every moment. This is why old pain resurfaces when life slows down. In quiet moments, during exhaustion, or in moments of vulnerability, what was supposedly healed returns with surprising clarity. The emotion feels fresh because it was never processed, only postponed. Time did not close the wound, it buried it under layers of routine and repetition. True healing requires confrontation, not distance. It demands revisiting what hurts, understanding it, and integrating it into your story. Time alone cannot do this work. It only carries you forward while leaving fragments behind. The danger of relying on time is mistaking numbness for resolution. Distraction feels like relief, but it is temporary and conditional. Time moves whether healing happens or not. It doesn't discriminate between what is understood and what is avoided. It simply keeps going, pulling your attention forward and giving you enough space to function. Healing, when it happens, is deliberate. Time merely ensures you don't stay still long enough to notice how much remains unresolved beneath the surface. You don't fear death. You fear unfinished thoughts. Death is often described as the ultimate fear, but what truly unsettles the mind is not the end of breathing. It is the interruption of thinking. The terror lies less in non-existence and more in incompletion. The mind clings to its questions, regrets, plans, and narratives, and death threatens to cut the story mid-sentence. What feels frightening is not disappearing, but leaving thoughts unresolved, meanings unconfirmed, and identities unfinished. The human mind is built to seek closure. It wants arcs, conclusions, and coherence. When life continues, unfinished thoughts can be postponed with the belief that there will be time later. Death removes that comfort. It forces the realization that the mind may never get the final clarification it's chasing. Words unsaid, ideas unexplored, truths half understood linger as open loops, and the mind recoils from the idea of them being sealed forever. This is why people fear sudden endings more than gradual ones. It's not the moment of dying that feels unbearable, but the idea of leaving without resolution. The mind imagines its projects abandoned, its questions unanswered, its internal debates frozen. Even legacy is a form of mental continuity, an attempt to let thoughts outlive the body so they can keep moving. If consciousness could truly accept stillness, death would feel quieter. But the thinking mind is restless by design. It defines itself through continuation. To stop thinking feels like betrayal of its purpose. Death represents the ultimate interruption, not of life, but of mental momentum. What you fear is not the void after thought ends, but the awareness that your inner dialogue will not get the chance to finish speaking. Most people don't change, they just rebrand their patterns. Change is often announced loudly, but lived quietly, if it happens at all. What usually shifts is not behavior at its root, but the story told about it. The same impulses, fears, and coping mechanisms remain, only dressed in new language. What was once called insecurity becomes high standards. What was avoidance becomes protecting peace. The pattern survives by changing its name. The mind resists real change because real change threatens identity. Patterns are familiar. They provide predictability even when they cause pain. To truly change would mean confronting the discomfort of acting without a script, of responding without the safety of habit. That level of disruption feels dangerous, so the mind negotiates instead. It allows surface-level modification while preserving the core structure underneath. Rebranding works because it feels like progress without requiring sacrifice. New insights are gathered, new labels adopted, and new explanations rehearsed. The person feels evolved because the narrative has evolved. Yet under pressure, the old responses reappear instantly, revealing that understanding alone did not dismantle the mechanism. Awareness improved the commentary, not the behavior. This is why people can speak fluently about growth while repeating the same relational cycles, emotional reactions, and self-sabotaging choices. The language becomes more refined, the justifications more convincing, but the outcome remains unchanged. Patterns are adaptive. When exposed, they don't disappear. They disguise themselves. True change is quiet, uncomfortable, and often unrecognizable to the self at first. It doesn't feel like becoming better. It feels like losing something familiar. Most people mistake insight for transformation because insight is mentally rewarding. But patterns are not impressed by words. They dissolve only when repeatedly denied their usual response. Until then, they persist under new branding, wearing the mask of evolution while behaving exactly as before. Self-awareness is knowing exactly why you're trapped and doing nothing anyway. Self-awareness is often praised as the turning point, the moment where insight transforms into change. In practice, it is frequently something far colder. It is the ability to watch yourself repeat the same behaviors while fully understanding their origin. You see the fear driving your choices, the habit sustaining the cycle, the thought that always triggers the collapse. And yet, nothing stops. What makes self-awareness painful is not ignorance, but clarity without movement. You recognize the pattern forming as it forms. You can name it, trace it back, explain it with precision. This creates the illusion of progress. Understanding feels like action, so the mind mistakes explanation for escape. But insight alone does not dismantle the structure it exposes. Self-awareness removes excuses while leaving the mechanism intact. You can no longer pretend you don't know better, yet knowing better does not automatically grant control. This gap between understanding and change becomes its own prison. Each repetition feels heavier because it now carries the weight of awareness. Failure is no longer accidental. It feels deliberate, even when it isn't. There is also a quiet comfort in familiarity. Even painful patterns feel safer than the uncertainty of change. Self-awareness does not erase fear, it sharpens it. You see exactly what must be done, and you see the cost of doing it. Inaction becomes a choice made not from ignorance, but from self-protection. This is the paradox of self-awareness. It illuminates the cage perfectly, mapping every lock and hinge, while leaving you standing still inside it. Not because escape is impossible, but because knowing the reason you're trapped does not always make leaving less terrifying. Morality shifts when survival feels threatened. Morality feels solid only when life is comfortable. When survival is secure, principles appear absolute, values feel non-negotiable, and ethical lines seem clear. But the moment survival is threatened, morality begins to bend. Not because people suddenly become evil, but because fear reorganizes priorities faster than logic ever could. Survival doesn't argue, it overrides. Under threat, the mind narrows. Long-term ideals give way to immediate needs. What once felt wrong becomes understandable, then justifiable, then necessary. Theft becomes provision. Deception becomes protection. Harm becomes prevention. Morality doesn't disappear. It adapts to the conditions it is placed under. The same person who once preached fairness may rationalize cruelty when resources, status, or safety feel endangered. This shift reveals an uncomfortable truth. Much of morality is contextual. It is shaped by environment, stability, and perceived risk. When consequences feel distant, ethics remain intact. When consequences feel imminent, ethics become flexible. The mind reframes actions not as betrayals of values, but as exceptions made under pressure. It tells itself the rules will return once safety is restored, ignoring how easily those rules dissolved. History exposes this pattern repeatedly. Ordinary people commit extraordinary acts when fear convinces them there is no alternative. Survival pressure strips morality down to its core function, not to be pure, but to keep the organism alive. Ideals exist in theory. Survival exists in the body. This doesn't mean morality is meaningless. It means it is fragile. It depends on conditions most people take for granted. When survival feels threatened, morality reveals its true nature, not as an unbreakable code, but as a luxury of stability, upheld only as long as fear allows it. You are not afraid of being wrong. You're afraid of losing coherence. Being wrong is rarely the true threat. The deeper fear lies in what being wrong would dismantle. Coherence is how the mind survives reality. It is the internal structure that holds beliefs, values, memories, and identity together into a story that feels stable. When something challenges that structure, the danger is not error, but collapse. To be wrong is to risk unraveling the narrative that tells you who you are and why your past choices made sense. The mind doesn't cling to beliefs because they are accurate. It clings to them because they connect. Each belief supports another, forming a mental ecosystem where removing one idea destabilizes many others. Admitting you are wrong can mean questioning your judgment, your motives, and your self-image. It can force you to revisit decisions that once felt justified and see them as avoidable. This is not intellectual discomfort. It is existential threat. Coherence provides continuity. It allows the mind to move forward without constantly renegotiating reality. When coherence is intact, even flawed beliefs feel safer than uncertainty. Being wrong introduces fragmentation. It creates gaps where certainty once lived. The mind resists this, not out of arrogance, but out of self-preservation. A fractured narrative feels like psychological free fall. This is why people defend ideas long after evidence disproves them. The argument is not about truth, it is about stability. Losing coherence means rebuilding the internal map, and rebuilding requires confronting ambiguity, guilt, and vulnerability. The mind would rather maintain a consistent illusion than face the chaos of redefinition. You don't fear correction, you fear disorientation. You fear the moment where the story you've been telling yourself no longer holds together, leaving you without a clear role or direction. Being wrong is survivable. Losing coherence feels like losing the ground beneath thought itself. Happiness is temporary alignment between expectation and illusion. Happiness feels real, but it is fragile by design. It appears in moments when what you expect from life briefly matches the story you believe about how life should be. In those moments, reality doesn't resist you. It seems to cooperate. The mind relaxes, not because everything is objectively good, but because nothing is currently contradicting its internal narrative. Expectation is the silent architect behind happiness. You imagine outcomes, roles, futures, and meanings, often without realizing it. When events align with those expectations, the mind interprets the alignment as happiness. When they don't, disappointment follows immediately. The emotional swing is not caused by reality itself, but by how closely reality mirrors the illusion you were holding. The illusion is necessary. It gives life shape, direction, and momentum. Without it, experience would feel flat and unmotivated. But illusions are unstable. They rely on the world continuing to behave in ways it was never obligated to. Happiness fades the moment reality drifts, when people change, circumstances shift, or time reveals what was previously hidden. This is why happiness feels fleeting even when life seems successful. The mind quickly updates its expectations. What once felt like fulfillment becomes the new baseline, and the illusion must be adjusted upward to recreate the feeling. The alignment breaks, and the search resumes, not for joy itself, but for another moment where the story and the experience overlap again. Happiness is not false, but it is conditional. It exists in the narrow space where desire pauses because it believes it has arrived. That pause never lasts. Reality continues moving, expectations regenerate, and the illusion reshapes itself. Happiness disappears, not because something went wrong, but because alignment was never meant to be permanent in a mind that constantly imagines more than the present can sustain. Every answer creates a more uncomfortable question. Answers feel like relief. They arrive with the promise of closure, of tension finally dissolving into clarity. The mind craves them because unanswered questions feel like open wounds. Yet answers rarely end the search. They simply shift it. Each answer redraws the boundaries of understanding, exposing new edges where uncertainty waits. When the mind receives an answer, it doesn't rest. It recalibrates. What once felt mysterious becomes familiar, and familiarity invites deeper scrutiny. The answer raises implications, consequences, and contradictions that weren't visible before. What begins as resolution quickly becomes destabilization. The comfort of knowing is short-lived, replaced by a sharper awareness of what still remains unresolved. The discomfort grows because the questions become more personal. Early questions are abstract, distant, safe. Later ones cut closer to identity, responsibility, and limitation. Answers about the world lead to questions about the self. Answers about how things work lead to questions about why they matter. Each layer removed reveals a more exposed surface beneath. This is why the search for knowledge often increases anxiety rather than easing it. The mind realizes that understanding does not simplify reality. It complicates it. The more accurately you see, the harder it becomes to retreat into ignorance. Each answer removes one illusion while revealing several more vulnerabilities. The mind continues anyway, driven by the belief that somewhere there must be a final answer that settles everything. But that belief itself becomes the most uncomfortable question of all. Because if every answer only deepens the unease, then the problem may not be the lack of answers, but the expectation that knowing was ever supposed to feel comfortable. The mind seeks closure because open loops feel like threats. The mind is deeply uncomfortable with unfinished narratives. An unanswered question, an unresolved conflict, or an unclear outcome lingers like a low hum in the background of awareness. This discomfort isn't intellectual, it's physiological. Open loops trigger tension because the mind interprets uncertainty as danger. If something is unresolved, it feels as though something important is being neglected, something that could return with consequences. Closure provides relief not because it always brings truth, but because it restores a sense of control. The mind would rather accept a flawed explanation than tolerate ambiguity. An imperfect answer feels safer than no answer at all. This is why people rush to conclusions, cling to labels, and prematurely define experiences. Certainty calms the nervous system, even when it distorts reality. Open loops demand mental energy. They pull attention away from the present, replaying themselves in thought, waiting to be closed. The mind treats them like alarms left ringing. Each replay feels like preparation, as if continued thinking will eventually produce safety. In reality, many situations cannot be fully resolved. Some conversations end without clarity. Some relationships end without explanation. Some questions have no satisfying answer. Yet the mind struggles to accept this. It equates closure with survival. Without a clear ending, it imagines vulnerability, missed threats, hidden meanings, unresolved risks. This is why memories resurface years later, why regret lingers, and why hypothetical conversations keep repeating. The loop stays open because the mind believes it must. Closure is not always about truth. Often, it is about quieting fear. The mind doesn't seek endings because they are accurate, but because silence after uncertainty feels unsafe. Open loops represent loss of control, and the mind will exhaust itself trying to close them, not to understand reality more deeply, but to convince itself that nothing dangerous is left unresolved. You don't miss the past, you miss the person who didn't know yet. Nostalgia rarely longs for moments as they truly were. What it reaches for is a version of yourself that existed before certain realizations arrived. The past feels lighter, not because life was easier, but because knowledge was incomplete. You moved through experiences without the weight of foresight, consequence, or accumulated awareness. What you miss is not time, but innocence disguised as simplicity. As understanding grows, it layers experience with context. Events stop being isolated and begin to connect. Patterns emerge, disappointments become predictable, and outcomes feel less surprising. This knowledge is useful, but it is heavy. Looking back, the past appears peaceful because the mind forgets the confusion and magnifies the unburdened moments. You remember how it felt to not anticipate loss, to not recognize warning signs, to not replay conversations with added meaning. The person you were didn't know how things would unfold. They didn't yet understand how people change, how opportunities close, or how choices echo forward. That ignorance created presence. You were inside moments instead of standing above them, analyzing. The mind wasn't constantly preparing for impact. This is why returning to old places or routines never restores the feeling. The environment remains, but the perceiver has changed. You cannot step back into not knowing. Awareness has already altered the experience. What once felt spontaneous now feels scripted. Missing the past is grief for a self that can't be recovered. It's longing for the emotional freedom that comes from incomplete understanding. You don't want to go back in time. You want to feel unprotected by knowledge again, to experience life before awareness turned every moment into a calculation. Intelligence isolates before it liberates. Intelligence widens perception long before it offers freedom. At first, it separates. You begin to notice patterns others overlook, contradictions they ignore, and assumptions they accept without question. Conversations feel thinner. Shared beliefs feel fragile. What once felt like connection now feels like distance, not because others have changed, but because your lens has. This isolation is not arrogance, it is misalignment. Intelligence disrupts emotional synchrony. When you see the mechanics behind behavior, reactions lose their innocence. You understand why people act the way they do, but that understanding rarely brings comfort. it creates space. You can predict outcomes, sense undercurrents, and anticipate disappointment, which quietly removes you from the present moment others are still inhabiting. Before intelligence liberates, it burdens. You become responsible for what you notice. You can no longer rely on simple narratives without feeling dishonest. You see how often people choose certainty over truth, comfort over accuracy. Trying to communicate this gap often deepens loneliness because insight does not translate easily. What feels obvious to you can sound threatening or unnecessary to others. The mind adapts by retreating inward. Solitude becomes safer than constant translation. This is where intelligence is often mistaken for coldness or detachment, when in reality it is self-protection. You are not above others. You are simply no longer synchronized with the same illusions. Liberation, if it comes, arrives later. It appears when intelligence turns inward and releases the need to be understood, when it stops measuring itself against collective comfort. Until then, intelligence isolates because it removes shared delusion before it teaches acceptance. The distance you feel is not failure. It is the cost of seeing clearly in a world that survives by not looking too closely. Reality doesn't care about fairness. That concept was invented after disappointment. Fairness feels fundamental because humans need the world to make moral sense. The idea that effort should be rewarded, kindness returned, and wrongdoing punished provides emotional stability. It allows people to endure hardship with the belief that balance will eventually be restored. But reality itself operates without such concern. Events unfold according to cause, chance, and constraint, not justice. Fairness emerges only after expectation is violated. When outcomes fail to match effort or intention, disappointment appears, and fairness is invented as a way to protest that mismatch. It becomes a language for grief and frustration, a way to say that something should have gone differently. The problem is not that fairness is wrong, but that it is projected onto a system that never promised it. Clinging to fairness deepens suffering because it turns misfortune into personal betrayal. The mind doesn't just experience loss, it experiences injustice. This adds an emotional charge to pain, making it harder to accept. Reality, indifferent to moral accounting, continues regardless of how unfair it feels. The expectation of fairness creates a constant tension between what is and what should have been. This realization feels harsh because it removes comfort. If reality isn't fair, then effort doesn't guarantee outcome, goodness doesn't ensure protection, and suffering doesn't require justification. The mind resists this because it destabilizes the sense of order it depends on. Fairness still matters socially, ethically, and relationally. Humans need it to coexist, but expecting it from reality itself is where disappointment begins. Fairness was not discovered in nature. It was created to help people cope with the pain of realizing that the world does not adjust itself to human hope. Thoughts don't ask permission before shaping your life. Thoughts arrive unannounced, yet they quietly influence everything that follows. They don't wait for approval, logic, or evidence before settling into the mind. A single thought can alter perception, shift emotion, and redirect behavior long before it is examined. By the time awareness catches up, the thought has already done its work, shaping reactions and decisions from behind the scenes. The mind often assumes that control comes first and influence follows. In reality, influence precedes control. Thoughts appear automatically, conditioned by memory, fear, desire, and repetition. They suggest interpretations, assign meaning, and predict outcomes without asking whether they are welcome. The body responds before reason intervenes. Anxiety tightens, hope lifts, doubt hesitates, all triggered by internal dialogue that feels personal but is rarely chosen. Because thoughts sound like your own voice, they feel authoritative. The mind treats them as reliable narrators rather than spontaneous events. A thought about failure discourages action. A thought about threat heightens vigilance. A thought about worth reshapes identity. None of these ask consent. They assume access, moving directly from idea to impact. Over time, repeated thoughts harden into patterns. Patterns become habits of perception. Habits of perception become life direction. You don't decide to be cautious, resentful, confident, or withdrawn in a single moment. Those states emerge from thoughts repeated often enough to feel true. By the time they are questioned, they already feel like facts. This is why awareness alone feels late. You notice the influence after it has taken hold. Thoughts don't need permission because the mind grants it automatically, mistaking familiarity for truth. Life is shaped not by the thoughts you consciously endorse, but by the ones that pass through unnoticed, quietly steering choices, emotions, and futures before you ever realize you were following them. Meaning collapses the moment you look for it too closely. Meaning survives on distance. It functions best when it is felt indirectly, absorbed through movement, routine, and assumption. The moment you turn toward it and demand clarity, it begins to thin. What once felt solid becomes abstract, and what once motivated you starts to feel suspicious. Meaning does not withstand interrogation because it was never built to be examined. It was built to be lived through. When you search for meaning, you assume it exists as something stable and external, waiting to be uncovered like a hidden object. But meaning is not an object. It is a psychological effect. It emerges when attention is directed outward, toward action, connection, or survival. The moment attention turns inward to analyze meaning itself, the mechanism breaks. The mind pulls apart the experience that created the feeling and expects it to remain intact. This is why people feel most lost during periods of reflection rather than motion. When life is happening quickly, meaning feels implicit. When life slows down and the question why becomes constant, meaning begins to erode. The mind dissects purpose into components: biology, conditioning, coincidence, and in doing so, removes the emotional glue that held it together. Looking too closely exposes the scaffolding. You see that meaning is sustained by belief, repetition, and narrative rather than certainty. Once exposed, it cannot perform the same function. The search itself becomes corrosive, replacing engagement with evaluation. This does not mean meaning is fake. It means meaning is fragile. It requires participation more than proof. The moment you demand that it justify itself, it retreats. Meaning isn't designed to survive scrutiny, it's designed to help you move. When you stop moving and start staring, what once carried you quietly dissolves under the weight of attention, leaving behind not answers, but a sharper awareness of absence. Anxiety is imagination without optimism. Anxiety does not come from danger itself, but from the mind's ability to imagine danger endlessly without believing in a positive outcome. The same imagination that fuels creativity, planning, and innovation turns against itself when optimism is removed. The mind continues to project futures, but every projection bends toward loss, failure, or collapse. Possibility remains, but hope is filtered out. Imagination gives anxiety its realism. The scenarios feel vivid, detailed, and urgent, even when they have not happened. The body reacts as if the imagined threat is already present. Muscles tense, breathing shortens, and attention narrows. Anxiety convinces you that preparation requires fear, that vigilance equals safety. In reality, it is imagination running unchecked by trust. Optimism is not blind positivity. It is the belief that uncertainty does not automatically mean catastrophe. When optimism is absent, uncertainty becomes hostile. Every unknown turns into a potential threat. The mind scans constantly, not for opportunity, but for confirmation of its worst expectations. This makes anxiety self-reinforcing. The more the mind imagines, the more danger it sees, and the more justified the anxiety feels. What makes anxiety exhausting is that it feels productive. You are thinking, anticipating, planning. But none of this leads to resolution because imagination alone cannot deliver certainty. It only multiplies possibilities. Without optimism to balance it, imagination creates endless futures with no safe landing point. Anxiety is not weakness, it is misdirected intelligence. It is the mind doing what it does best, projecting, while believing that nothing good will intervene. Until imagination is paired with trust in outcomes you cannot control, it will continue to rehearse disaster, mistaking constant mental motion for protection and confusing awareness with preparedness. The ego survives by convincing you it is necessary. The ego does not announce itself as a problem. It presents itself as protection. It frames its presence as essential for survival, identity, and direction, quietly persuading you that without it, you would collapse into confusion or vulnerability. This belief keeps it alive. The ego survives not through force, but through persuasion. At its core, the ego is a structure built from past experiences, fears, comparisons, and self-images. It organizes the world into me and not me, creating boundaries that feel necessary for safety. It tells you who you are, what you deserve, and how you should be seen. In doing so, it offers coherence in a chaotic environment. The mind clings to this coherence, mistaking it for stability. The ego amplifies threats to justify its role. Criticism becomes danger. Failure becomes identity. Disagreement feels like erasure. By turning ordinary experiences into existential risks, the ego reinforces the idea that it must stay alert and dominant. Letting go feels reckless, as if losing the ego would mean losing selfhood entirely. What makes the ego powerful is that it borrows your voice. Its thoughts sound like your own reasoning. Its defenses feel like logic. This makes it difficult to challenge without feeling internally divided. Any attempt to soften the ego is framed as weakness or loss of control. The uncomfortable truth is that the ego is not required for existence, but it is required for the version of control it promises. It persists by convincing you that it is the only thing standing between you and chaos, even though much of the chaos it warns you about is created by its constant need to defend itself. Knowledge removes comfort faster than it removes ignorance. Knowledge is often pursued as relief, as if understanding will immediately replace confusion with peace. In practice, it does the opposite. The first thing knowledge takes away is comfort. It strips the mind of simple explanations, familiar illusions, and protective narratives long before it replaces them with clarity. Ignorance doesn't vanish all at once. It fractures, leaving discomfort in its place. When you learn something new, you don't suddenly know everything. You become aware of how much you didn't know. Each insight exposes another layer of uncertainty. Assumptions that once felt stable begin to wobble. Beliefs that provided emotional shelter lose their credibility. What once felt certain now feels conditional, fragile, or incomplete. The mind loses its resting places faster than it gains new ones. Comfort thrives on simplicity. Knowledge thrives on complexity. As understanding deepens, life becomes harder to explain cleanly. Motives grow ambiguous. Outcomes feel less predictable. Moral clarity blurs. The world stops fitting neatly into right and wrong, safe and dangerous, success and failure. This loss of simplicity is not ignorance being removed. It is comfort being dismantled. What makes this unsettling is that ignorance often persists alongside knowledge. You know more, yet still not enough. You see deeper, yet never deeply enough to feel finished. The mind sits in an uncomfortable in-between state, no longer protected by not knowing, but not yet stabilized by wisdom. This is why many people resist learning after a certain point. Knowledge threatens emotional safety before it offers understanding. It demands tolerance for uncertainty, ambiguity, and unresolved tension. Comfort fades quickly because it relied on not seeing too much. Ignorance lingers because complexity never fully resolves. Knowledge does not gently enlighten. It destabilizes first, forcing the mind to adapt to a reality that no longer offers easy reassurance. You can understand everything and still feel nothing resolved. Understanding creates the illusion of closure, but closure is not a logical outcome. The mind assumes that once something is explained, it will loosen its grip. Yet understanding often intensifies awareness without providing relief. You can trace every cause, map every pattern, and name every mechanism involved, and still feel the same internal tension. Knowledge clarifies the problem, but it does not dissolve it. The reason is that understanding operates in the realm of explanation, while resolution lives in the realm of acceptance and change. The mind excels at analysis because analysis feels active and controlled. It believes that if it keeps dissecting, a final insight will arrive that settles everything. When that insight comes and nothing shifts emotionally, the disappointment is sharp. You did the work, you saw the truth, and still, the weight remains. Understanding can even trap you. Once you know why something hurts, you can no longer attribute the pain to confusion or ignorance. The suffering becomes cleaner, more precise, and harder to escape. You know the origin, the triggers, the patterns, and the outcomes. This awareness removes mystery, but leaves repetition intact. The mind becomes a witness rather than a participant in change. This creates a hollow clarity. You are no longer lost, but you are not free. Insight explains the cage without opening it. The brain keeps presenting understanding as progress because it has nothing else to offer. It cannot force resolution. It can only narrate the lack of it. Resolution requires surrender, action, or loss, things the thinking mind resists. So you remain informed but unsettled, intelligent but unresolved. Understanding answers the question of why, but it remains silent on now what. And in that silence, the mind realizes that explanation was never the finish line it hoped it would be. Progress is often just better managed despair. Progress is usually framed as improvement, as movement away from suffering towards something better. But beneath that narrative lies a quieter truth. Much of what is called progress is simply learning how to endure despair more efficiently. The problems don't disappear. They are reorganized, optimized, and given systems to live within. Life becomes less chaotic, not less heavy. Early struggle is raw and disorienting. Pain feels overwhelming because it lacks structure. Over time, people learn routines, coping strategies, and explanations that make suffering predictable. This predictability is labeled growth. You're not drowning anymore. You're floating just enough to keep going. The despair remains, but it no longer interrupts daily function, which is mistaken for resolution. Progress often means lowering expectations without admitting it. Dreams are adjusted, hopes narrowed, and ideals softened until they fit reality's constraints. This recalibration feels like maturity. You stop demanding fulfillment and start aiming for sustainability. The absence of collapse is celebrated as success. Stability replaces joy, and endurance is rebranded as achievement. Systems play a key role in this illusion. Careers, schedules, metrics, and routines give despair a container. As long as pain fits inside the structure, it is considered manageable. Society rewards those who can function despite emptiness. not those who question why emptiness persists. Progress becomes the ability to carry weight silently and call it strength. This doesn't make progress meaningless, but it makes it honest. Improvement often isn't about eliminating despair. It's about negotiating with it. You learn when to suppress it, when to distract from it, and when to let it surface without derailing your life. What changes is not the presence of suffering, but your relationship to it. Progress is rarely transcendence. More often, it's survival refined into a system that looks like forward motion. Explanations don't reduce pain, they make it permanent. Explanations are often sought as remedies. The mind believes that if it can understand why something hurt, the pain will loosen its grip. Knowing the cause feels like progress, like a step toward closure. But explanation doesn't dissolve pain, it preserves it. It gives pain a story, and stories are easy to revisit. When an experience remains unexplained, it can fade into sensation and memory without structure. Once explained, it becomes organized. The mind labels it, categorizes it, and files it away with meaning attached. This meaning becomes the handle by which pain is repeatedly picked up. Each retelling reinforces its presence, keeping it alive through narrative. Explanations also anchor pain to identity. This happened because slowly turns into, this is who I am now. The mind builds a logical bridge from event to self-concept, making the pain feel justified and therefore harder to release. Letting go begins to feel like denying reality, as if healing would mean betraying the truth of what occurred. Understanding why someone hurt you, why you failed, or why things fell apart does not remove the emotional imprint. It often deepens it by adding layers of interpretation, blame, and permanence. The mind replays the explanation, refining it, defending it, and using it as evidence. Pain becomes permanent, not because it was severe, but because it was made meaningful. Explanations freeze experience in place, turning a moment into a lesson that never ends. The mind confuses understanding with resolution, unaware that some pain only softens when it is no longer explained, justified, or carried forward as something that must be remembered to remain valid. The mind resists silence because silence exposes emptiness. Silence is not neutral to the mind. It is confrontational. When noise fades and distractions fall away, the mind is left alone with itself, and what it often finds is not clarity, but absence. No immediate purpose, no clear direction, no reassuring narrative. This emptiness feels threatening, not because it is harmful, but because it offers nothing for the mind to hold on to. The mind survives through movement. Thoughts, plans, worries, and memories create a sense of continuity and relevance. Silence interrupts that flow. Without mental activity, the mind loses its sense of function. It no longer knows what it is supposed to do. This loss of role is interpreted as danger. To avoid it, the mind fills space with noise, internal dialogue, imagined conversations, replayed memories, or projected futures. What silence exposes is not necessarily meaninglessness, but the absence of the structures the mind depends on. Identity feels thinner. Time feels slower. Existence feels less narrated. In silence, there is no immediate confirmation that you are doing something, becoming something, or moving towards something. For a mind conditioned to equate value with activity, this feels like erasure. The discomfort intensifies because emptiness cannot be argued with. You cannot reason it away or solve it. It does not respond to analysis. Silence offers no feedback, no reassurance, and no resistance. It simply remains. The mind, desperate to reassert itself, reacts by creating urgency, inventing problems, or chasing stimulation. Silence is not unbearable because it is empty, but because it removes the mind's illusions. It reveals how much of mental noise exists not to understand life, but to avoid facing the quiet truth that beneath constant thinking, there may be nothing demanding explanation at all. You can outthink others and still lose to yourself. Outthinking others creates a sense of advantage. You see angles they miss, anticipate reactions, and dismantle arguments with precision. This intellectual edge feels like protection, as if awareness and strategy guarantee control. Yet the most complex battles do not happen externally. They unfold inward, where intelligence offers no immunity. The mind that defeats others with ease often struggles most against its own patterns. Your thoughts know you too well. They exploit your fears, values, memories, and blind spots with surgical accuracy. There is no surprise element, no opponent to read, no logic to outmaneuver. The same intelligence that dissects the world turns inward and multiplies doubt, hesitation, and self-critique. You can win every debate and still remain stuck in the same internal loop. This is because thinking is not neutral. It is shaped by emotion, history, and identity. When reasoning serves ego or fear, it becomes a weapon against yourself. You justify avoidance, rationalize stagnation, and overanalyze decisions until momentum collapses. The mind builds airtight arguments for inaction and calls it wisdom. Outthinking others also reinforces isolation. You begin to distrust simplicity, dismissing solutions that don't satisfy your depth. Advice feels shallow, encouragement feels naive, and action feels premature. You wait for certainty that never arrives. Meanwhile, others move forward with less understanding and fewer guarantees, gaining ground while you refine theories. Losing to yourself doesn't look dramatic. It looks like awareness without movement. You know exactly what's happening and why, yet nothing changes. Intelligence becomes the reason you delay, the excuse you refine, the shield you hide behind. You don't lose because you lack insight. You lose because your mind is skilled enough to trap itself while convincing you that you're being careful, rational, and in control. Awareness doesn't stop cycles, it just narrates them. Awareness is often mistaken for interruption, as if noticing a pattern automatically dismantles it. In reality, awareness is usually a witness, not an authority. It observes the cycle forming, recognizes the familiar thoughts, predicts the outcome, and then watches it unfold anyway. Nothing is hidden anymore, yet nothing is prevented. The loop continues, only now with commentary. This creates a strange kind of helpless clarity. You see the trigger, feel the reaction rising, and know exactly where it leads. The mind narrates the process in real time, why it's happening, what it means, how it's connected to the past. This narration feels intelligent, even responsible, but it doesn't alter behavior. It simply documents repetition with increasing accuracy. What makes this painful is the expectation that awareness should be enough. When it isn't, frustration turns inward. You blame yourself for knowing better and still doing the same thing. Awareness becomes another layer of suffering, stacking judgment on top of habit. The cycle tightens because now it includes self-criticism alongside the original pattern. Cycles persist because they are rooted in conditioning, not ignorance. They live in the nervous system, in emotional memory, in automatic responses that bypass conscious choice. Awareness operates at the level of thought, while many cycles are enforced at the level of reaction. Seeing the mechanism does not immediately override it. True interruption requires repeated action, not just recognition. It demands discomfort, delay, and inconsistency with the old pattern. Awareness can point to the door, but it will not walk you through it. Until behavior changes, awareness remains a narrator, articulate, honest, and powerless, describing the same story as it plays again, only with better vocabulary and less illusion. Certainty feels good because it ends the questioning, not because it's true. Certainty arrives with relief. The moment the mind decides it knows, the tension of not knowing dissolves, questions fall silent, doubt retreats, and the internal noise quiets. This calm is often mistaken for truth. In reality, it is simply the absence of friction. Certainty feels good, not because it aligns with reality, but because it shuts down the mental effort required to keep searching. The mind experiences questioning as instability. Each unanswered thought keeps the system open, vulnerable, and alert. Certainty closes the loop. It offers psychological rest by declaring the inquiry finished. Whether the conclusion is accurate becomes secondary to how complete it feels. Confidence replaces curiosity, and decisiveness masks uncertainty. This is why false beliefs can feel as satisfying as true ones. As long as they are firm, they provide the same relief. Certainty creates the illusion of control by giving the mind something solid to stand on, even if that ground is imagined. Once certainty sets in, alternative perspectives become irritating, not because they are wrong, but because they threaten to reopen the question. The pleasure of certainty also explains why people defend beliefs so aggressively. Letting go would mean returning to discomfort, ambiguity, and effort. The mind resists this not out of loyalty to truth, but out of a desire for rest. Truth rarely offers this kind of closure. It remains flexible, complex, and incomplete. Certainty rejects that complexity in favor of peace. What feels like knowing is often just the mind choosing quiet over accuracy, ending the questioning not because it has reached truth, but because it is tired of carrying the uncertainty any longer. Existence offers no instructions, only consequences. Life does not arrive with a manual. There is no clear sequence to follow, no universal rules guaranteeing safety, fulfillment, or meaning. Existence unfolds without guidance, leaving the mind searching for signs, formulas, and principles to cling to. What it finds instead are consequences, outcomes that occur whether or not intentions were clear or choices were fully understood. The mind wants instructions because instructions imply fairness. They suggest that if you follow the steps correctly, results will be predictable and just. Existence does not operate that way. Actions ripple outward without regard for intent, and outcomes often arrive disconnected from effort. You can do everything right and still suffer. You can act carelessly and still succeed. This unpredictability unsettles the need for order. Consequences do not explain themselves. They simply occur, forcing adaptation after the fact. You learn not by being warned, but by being impacted. Pain teaches faster than advice. Loss clarifies more than theory. Experience replaces guidance with memory, and memory becomes the only reference point the mind trusts. This lack of instruction pushes humans to invent systems, rules, morals, goals, identities, to simulate structure. These frameworks feel like guidance, but they are interpretations layered onto a neutral process. Existence does not reward belief, it responds to action. It does not care why a choice was made, only that it was made. What makes this difficult to accept is the absence of negotiation. You cannot ask life for clarification before acting. You move first, and consequences follow. Understanding often arrives too late to prevent impact. Existence remains silent while outcomes speak loudly. This silence forces responsibility without reassurance. There is no confirmation that you are on the right path, only feedback after movement. Existence doesn't teach through instructions. It teaches through results, leaving the mind to piece together meaning from whatever consequences remain. Overthinking is the mind refusing to accept uncertainty as final. Uncertainty feels intolerable to the thinking mind. It represents an open ending, a lack of control, and a threat to coherence. Overthinking emerges as a response to this discomfort. It is the mind's attempt to outwork the unknown, to exhaust every possible angle in the hope that uncertainty will eventually collapse into clarity. The problem is that some questions do not have final answers, and the mind refuses to accept that. Overthinking gives the illusion of progress. Each thought feels like a step closer to resolution, even when it is circling the same territory. The mind treats uncertainty as a temporary obstacle rather than a permanent condition. It believes that if it just thinks harder, longer, or deeper, certainty will appear. This belief keeps the loop alive. Stopping feels irresponsible, as if letting go means surrendering to chaos. At its core, overthinking is an avoidance of acceptance. Accepting uncertainty would require tolerating vulnerability, risk, and the possibility of being wrong without correction. The mind resists this exposure. Thinking becomes a buffer, a way to stay busy while postponing emotional commitment. As long as you are analyzing, you are not choosing. As long as you are questioning, you are not vulnerable to outcome. The tragedy is that overthinking does not reduce uncertainty. It amplifies awareness of it. Each new angle exposes more unknowns, feeding the cycle. The mind mistakes activity for safety and complexity for depth. Uncertainty remains untouched, standing quietly beneath the noise. Overthinking persists because the mind believes endings must exist. It cannot accept that some truths are partial, some outcomes unknowable, and some answers absent. So it keeps thinking, not to find certainty, but to avoid admitting that uncertainty may be the final state. Most truths are survivable, only in fragments. Truth is often imagined as something that arrives whole, clear, and final. In reality, full exposure to truth is rarely tolerable. The human mind is not built to absorb reality in its entirety at once. It filters, dilutes, and breaks understanding into pieces small enough to carry. This is not weakness, but necessity. Too much clarity too quickly destabilizes rather than enlightens. Fragments allow truth to enter without overwhelming the system. A partial realization can be integrated, lived with, and adjusted to. A complete one can shatter identity, belief, and emotional equilibrium. This is why insight often comes slowly, disguised as coincidence, intuition, or gradual discomfort. The mind protects itself by rationing what it allows itself to know. Beliefs function as shock absorbers. They soften truths that would otherwise feel unbearable. When those beliefs crack, they rarely collapse all at once. Instead, they leak. A doubt here, a contradiction there. Each fragment weakens the structure just enough for adaptation to occur. Sudden, total collapse is traumatic. Gradual erosion is survivable. This is also why people resist being confronted with the whole truth. It's not dishonesty, it's self-preservation. Complete exposure threatens meaning, belonging, and stability. Fragments allow denial to coexist with awareness, buying time to reorganize one's inner world. Even emotional truths follow this rule. Grief, regret, and responsibility are processed in waves, not floods. The mind revisits them repeatedly, each time able to tolerate a little more. What feels like avoidance is often pacing. Truth does not arrive to save you. It arrives to rearrange you. Fragments make that rearrangement possible. They allow understanding to deepen without destroying the structure required to function. Some truths, if revealed all at once, would not enlighten at all. They would simply overwhelm. Consciousness is the cost of perception. Perception seems like a gift until its price becomes clear. To perceive is not merely to see, but to be aware that you are seeing. Consciousness adds a layer of reflection to every experience, turning sensation into interpretation. Nothing arrives unfiltered. Every sound, feeling, and moment is processed, named, remembered, and judged. This awareness sharpens experience, but it also burdens it. Without consciousness, perception would pass through and disappear. With consciousness, it lingers. Pain is not just felt, it is anticipated and recalled. Pleasure is not just experienced, it is compared, feared to be lost, and chased again. Consciousness stretches moments beyond their natural lifespan, multiplying their impact. What could have been brief becomes persistent. The cost appears in self-awareness. You don't just exist, you know that you exist. This knowledge brings questions that cannot be unanswered about meaning, mortality, identity, and time. Perception exposes reality, but consciousness forces you to live with that exposure continuously. There is no off switch. Even in rest, the mind watches itself resting. Consciousness also creates separation. You observe the world and yourself as objects, creating distance from direct experience. This distance allows insight and creativity, but it also prevents full immersion. You are never entirely inside the moment. Part of you is always standing back, evaluating it. This is the trade. To perceive deeply is to carry awareness, and to carry awareness is to accept its weight. Consciousness grants clarity, imagination, and understanding, but it charges for them in restlessness and vulnerability. You see more, feel more, remember more, and in doing so, you pay the ongoing price of knowing that you are perceiving at all. You don't chase answers, you chase relief. The mind tells itself it is searching for truth, clarity, or understanding, but beneath that narrative lies a quieter motive. What it actually wants is relief. Relief from uncertainty, tension, doubt, and the discomfort of not knowing. Answers are not valuable because they are correct. They are valuable because they promise rest. They suggest that once something is explained, the internal pressure will finally ease. Questions create friction in the nervous system. An unresolved issue keeps attention hooked, thoughts circling, emotions unsettled. The mind interprets this unease as a problem to solve. It believes that the right answer will bring calm, closure, and safety. This belief fuels endless research, rumination, and analysis, even when the subject itself holds little practical importance. When an answer is found, the relief is immediate but brief. The mind relaxes not because it has reached truth, but because tension has been interrupted. Soon after, another question forms. Another uncertainty appears, and the cycle resumes. This pattern reveals that the pursuit was never about understanding reality in full, but about managing internal discomfort in manageable doses. The mind prefers explanations that feel soothing over those that are accurate. It gravitates toward narratives that reduce anxiety, even if they oversimplify or distort. Comforting answers are chosen over complex truths because they quiet the body. The sense of knowing acts like a sedative. What remains unacknowledged is that no amount of answers can permanently relieve uncertainty. Reality does not resolve cleanly. The mind keeps chasing not because answers are scarce, but because relief is temporary. Each answer is a pause, not an ending, and the search continues not out of curiosity, but out of the need to feel calm, if only for a moment. Identity is built from what you fear losing. Identity feels like something you discover, but it is more often something you defend. The strongest parts of who you believe you are shaped not by freedom, but by attachment. What you cling to most tightly becomes central to your sense of self. The fear of losing something gives it weight, and that weight turns into identity. The mind organizes itself around preservation. Roles, beliefs, relationships, values, and achievements gain importance because they feel fragile. You invest in them emotionally, and over time, they stop feeling optional. They become proof of continuity. The more something feels at risk, the more the mind wraps itself around it, reinforcing the idea that without it, you would be diminished or unrecognizable. This is why threats to identity provoke such intense reactions. Criticism doesn't just challenge an idea, it threatens stability. Loss doesn't just remove something external, it destabilizes the internal structure built around it. The fear is not of absence, but of disintegration. If this disappears, who am I without it? The mind resists that question by hardening its attachments. Identity also narrows through fear. You avoid paths that might undermine what you've built. You reject perspectives that could weaken your narrative. Growth becomes dangerous when it risks loosening what feels essential. The self becomes less about exploration and more about maintenance. What's rarely acknowledged is that identity formed through fear is brittle. It demands constant reinforcement and defense. Yet the mind prefers this fragility to openness, because openness requires letting go of certainty. Identity is not constructed from what you love most, but from what you cannot imagine living without. Fear gives it shape, boundaries, and urgency, turning attachment into self-definition and making preservation feel like survival. Reflection becomes rumination when there's nowhere to act. Reflection is meant to orient you. It looks backward only to inform what comes next. But when action is unavailable, blocked, or repeatedly avoided, reflection has nowhere to go. The mind keeps returning to the same material, not to learn, but to discharge energy it cannot express. At that point, reflection quietly mutates into rumination. Rumination feels like thinking, but it produces no movement. The same events are replayed, the same conversations reanalyzed, the same alternatives imagined. Each pass promises clarity, yet delivers only exhaustion. What drives this loop is not curiosity, but constraint. The mind senses unresolved tension and tries to resolve it internally because external resolution feels impossible. Action is what closes mental loops. When you cannot change the past, confront the present, or influence the outcome, thought becomes circular. The mind treats thinking as a substitute for doing, even though it knows the substitution fails. This creates frustration layered on top of insight. You understand the situation, yet remain stuck inside it. Rumination also creates the illusion of responsibility. As long as you are thinking, you feel engaged, accountable, and vigilant. Stopping feels like negligence, as if silence would mean giving up. So the mind keeps spinning, mistaking persistence for progress. What turns reflection unhealthy is not depth, but stagnation. Without a path to act, reflection loses its purpose. It stops guiding behavior and starts reinforcing helplessness. Thought becomes a holding pattern, circling the same ground because landing feels unsafe or impossible. Until movement becomes available, the mind will keep revisiting the past, not because it hasn't understood it, but because it has nowhere else to place what it knows. The mind prefers complex misery over simple acceptance. Simple acceptance feels deceptively empty. It offers no drama, no narrative, no sense of struggle to justify existence. The mind recoils from this simplicity because it feels like erasure. Without analysis, without resistance, without explanation, the mind has nothing to do. Complex misery, on the other hand, keeps it busy. It provides problems to solve, loops to revisit, and emotions to dissect. Suffering becomes structured, and structure feels safer than silence. The mind is conditioned to believe that effort equals value. If pain is complicated, then enduring it feels meaningful. Overthinking transforms discomfort into something that appears intelligent and justified. Acceptance threatens this logic. It asks for nothing but surrender, and surrender feels like failure to a mind trained to equate control with survival. Complex misery also preserves identity. Struggles become stories, wounds become personality traits, and unresolved issues become proof of depth. Letting go would mean releasing the narrative that explains who you are. The mind resists this because identity feels more important than relief. Pain, when familiar, becomes predictable. Acceptance introduces uncertainty, not about suffering, but about who you are without it. There is also fear beneath the preference. Acceptance implies finality. It means nothing more needs to be done, no explanation left to uncover. The mind interprets this as stagnation or loss, even though it is peace. Misery, when layered with complexity, feels active and alive. It gives the illusion of progress, even when nothing changes. So the mind chooses tangled thoughts over quiet presence, rumination over release. Not because misery feels good, but because it feels occupied. Simple acceptance asks the mind to stop defending, stop narrating, stop fixing. And to a mind that survives through motion, stillness feels far more threatening than suffering ever could. Understanding motives doesn't excuse outcomes. The mind often believes that once it understands why something happened, the weight of what happened should lessen. Motives feel like explanations, and explanations feel like relief. But understanding intention does not undo impact. Outcomes exist independently of the reasons that produce them, and consequences remain even when motives are traced back to fear, ignorance, or pain. People seek motives because they humanize harm. If an action can be explained, it feels less chaotic, less cruel, less random. Understanding why someone acted the way they did creates empathy, and empathy can soften emotional reactions. Yet the outcome does not disappear. Damage does not reverse itself simply because it makes sense. Wounds do not heal faster because the cause was understandable. The mind struggles with this because it wants moral symmetry. It wants the story to balance. Good reasons leading to forgiveness, bad intentions leading to blame. Reality is less orderly. Someone can act from pain and still cause pain. Someone can mean well and still destroy something important. Motives explain behavior, but they do not erase its effects. This distinction is uncomfortable because it removes shortcuts to closure. Understanding does not automatically grant peace. You can fully grasp why something happened and still feel hurt, angry, or changed by it. The mind resists this because it wants resolution to come bundled with explanation. Recognizing motives is valuable, but it is incomplete. It clarifies context, not consequence. The outcome remains real, tangible, and lasting regardless of intention. Confusing understanding with absolution allows harm to be minimized and accountability to dissolve. Reality does not negotiate with explanations. What happened, happened, and no amount of insight into why it occurred can undo the impact it left behind. You can dismantle illusions and still need them to function. Illusions are often framed as weaknesses, false beliefs that clarity is meant to destroy. Yet many illusions are not errors in thinking, but psychological supports. They give shape to motivation, continuity to identity, and tolerability to existence. When you dismantle them, you may gain accuracy, but accuracy alone does not guarantee stability. The mind can see through illusions and still rely on them to keep moving. Some illusions are structural. The belief that effort will be rewarded, that suffering has meaning, or that control is attainable may not survive close examination, yet they organize behavior. Removing them does not replace their function. It simply exposes the raw mechanics beneath life, which can feel empty and disorienting. Without some distortion, reality becomes too neutral, too open, too unresolved for the mind to engage with easily. Dismantling illusions also removes emotional insulation. You see how arbitrary success can be, how fragile relationships are, how little certainty underpins long-term plans. This awareness may feel liberating at first, but over time, it can erode momentum. When nothing feels guaranteed, effort loses its narrative reward. action becomes heavier because it no longer carries the promise it once did. The mind adapts by quietly rebuilding softer illusions. It reframes, simplifies, or selectively ignores certain truths to restore functionality. This is not hypocrisy, it is survival. Complete clarity is not sustainable in daily life. To function, the mind needs meaning that is felt more than proven. This creates a paradox. You know the illusion is constructed, yet you participate in it anyway. You work, love, hope, and plan while aware of the fragility beneath it all. The goal shifts from believing illusions to using them. You don't return to ignorance, but you stop demanding purity from your understanding. Function requires friction, and illusions provide it. Without them, clarity becomes sterile, and life stalls under the weight of its own exposure. The more you know, the harder it is to pretend. Knowledge erodes illusion quietly, without asking permission. At first, it feels empowering. You understand more, see patterns more clearly, and recognize motivations beneath surface behavior. But with that clarity comes a subtle loss, the ability to participate fully in comforting fictions. Pretending begins to feel dishonest, even when it would make life easier. What once felt natural starts to feel performative. Social rituals, polite optimism, and shared narratives lose their innocence. You notice when enthusiasm is forced, when certainty is borrowed, when confidence masks fear. This awareness creates friction. To pretend would require suppressing what you see, and suppression demands energy. Over time, it becomes exhausting to act as if you don't know what you know. Knowledge removes plausible deniability. You can no longer tell yourself that outcomes are surprising, that patterns are random, or that effort alone guarantees results. This doesn't make life bleak, but it makes it honest. The cost of honesty is discomfort. You lose the refuge of ignorance, where hope can exist without evidence and belief doesn't need justification. Pretending is often a social lubricant. It keeps conversations smooth and expectations manageable. When you stop pretending, you risk alienation, not because you are wrong, but because you disrupt shared illusions. Others may sense the distance, even if they can't name it. This is why increased knowledge often leads to quiet withdrawal rather than loud superiority. It's not about feeling above others, it's about feeling unable to lie convincingly anymore. The world hasn't changed. The rules haven't either. What's changed is your tolerance for self-deception. And once that tolerance drops, pretending stops being harmless and starts feeling like a betrayal of your own awareness. Awareness sharpens pain before it dulls it. Awareness is often approached as a cure, a way to rise above suffering by understanding it. What is rarely acknowledged is its initial cruelty. Awareness does not soften pain at first, it intensifies it. The moment you become aware, sensation gains definition. What was once vague discomfort becomes precise, named, and impossible to ignore. Pain sharpens because it is no longer diffused by confusion or denial. Before awareness, the mind protects itself through distance. It distracts, rationalizes, or numbs. Awareness strips away those defenses. It brings pain into focus, forcing it into the foreground of experience. You notice not only what hurts, but how it hurts, when it appears, and what it triggers. This clarity can feel like punishment, as if seeing clearly has made everything worse. The sharpening occurs because awareness removes escape routes. You can no longer pretend you don't know what's happening. The pain becomes personal, intimate, and present. Every reaction is observed, every thought traced back to its source. This level of exposure overwhelms the nervous system before it educates it. Only later does awareness begin to dull pain. Repeated exposure without resistance changes the relationship. The mind stops fighting what it understands. Sensation loses its urgency once it is fully allowed. But this shift takes time, and many abandon awareness during the sharpening phase, mistaking intensity for failure. The truth is that awareness is not gentle in the beginning. It cuts before it soothes. It demands that pain be felt completely before it can be released. The dulling comes not from control, but from familiarity. Awareness doesn't eliminate pain by avoiding it. It wears it down through presence, proving that what is seen clearly no longer needs to scream to be acknowledged. Thoughts are convincing because they sound like you. Thoughts carry an authority that rarely gets questioned because they arrive in a familiar voice. They don't announce themselves as suggestions or possibilities. They present themselves as statements. Because they sound like you, they feel personal, trustworthy, and intentional, even when they are automatic, conditioned, or distorted. The mind rarely asks where a thought came from if it recognizes the tone. This familiarity creates credibility. A thought about failure feels like insight. A thought about danger feels like intuition. A thought about worth feels like truth. The mind doesn't pause to verify these impressions because they don't feel external. They feel internal, and internal feels reliable. What is overlooked is that the same voice has repeated countless false alarms, predictions, and narratives without consequence. Thoughts borrow identity to gain influence. They blend into the sense of self so seamlessly that disagreement feels like self-betrayal. Questioning a thought can feel unnatural, as if doubting your own perception rather than examining a mental event. This is how thoughts bypass scrutiny. They don't argue their case, they assume acceptance. Over time, repeated thoughts become beliefs, and beliefs become filters through which reality is interpreted. A single internal sentence can shift mood, posture, and behavior instantly. No external persuasion is required because the persuasion feels self-generated. The mind follows its own voice more readily than any other. What makes this dangerous is not that thoughts exist, but that they are mistaken for identity. The voice in your head feels like you, but it is not the totality of you. It is a stream, not an authority. Thoughts convince because they speak in first person, quietly shaping perception and action while remaining largely unquestioned, trusted simply because they sound like they belong. Rationality doesn't eliminate fear, it just names it. Rationality is often treated as an antidote to fear, as if understanding something fully will drain it of its power. In reality, rationality rarely dissolves fear. It categorizes it, explains it, and places it into language, but the emotional response remains intact. Fear does not disappear when it is understood, it simply becomes more articulate. The mind uses rationality to feel in control. By naming fear, assigning causes, and predicting outcomes, it creates the sense that the threat is being managed. Yet this management is conceptual, not emotional. You can know exactly why you are afraid, recognize that the fear is disproportionate, and still feel your body react as if danger is immediate. Rational insight does not override instinctive responses wired far deeper than thought. In some cases, rationality intensifies fear. Once fear is named, it becomes trackable. You anticipate it, monitor it, and replay it. The mind builds scenarios, probabilities, and contingencies, keeping the fear alive under the guise of preparedness. What feels like logic becomes a feedback loop that constantly refreshes the threat. Rationality also removes excuses. When fear lacks explanation, it can be dismissed as confusion. When it is understood, it feels justified. You know the risks, you know the consequences. Fear gains credibility. This makes avoidance easier to defend and hesitation easier to rationalize. Understanding fear is not the same as resolving it. Rationality operates in language and structure, while fear lives in sensation and anticipation. Naming fear gives it a place in thought, but it does not ask it to leave. The mind learns why it is afraid, but the body does not negotiate with explanations. Fear remains, quieter perhaps, but still present, observed, labeled, and carried rather than eliminated. The mind confuses depth with importance. The mind is drawn to complexity. The deeper a thought feels, the more weight it seems to carry. Layers of analysis, abstraction, and interpretation create the impression that something is significant simply because it is intricate. Depth becomes a proxy for value. If a thought takes time to unravel, the mind assumes it must matter. This confusion is subtle and persistent. Simple truths are often dismissed because they don't stimulate the intellect. They feel too obvious, too plain to justify attention. Meanwhile, complex ideas, especially those tied to identity, fear, or uncertainty, are elevated, revisited, and protected. The mind invests in them not because they improve life, but because they feel substantial. Depth also flatters intelligence. Engaging with complicated inner narratives makes the mind feel capable and sophisticated. It reinforces the belief that thinking harder equals thinking better. As a result, the mind gravitates toward problems that can be endlessly analyzed, even when they have little practical impact. Importance is assumed, not evaluated. This is why trivial moments can provoke intense rumination, while truly meaningful actions are delayed. The mind overvalues what feels intellectually rich and undervalues what feels emotionally simple but behaviorally demanding. Changing a habit may be important, but it lacks the depth that endless contemplation provides. By confusing depth with importance, the mind stays busy without being effective. It mistakes mental stimulation for progress and complexity for relevance. What actually matters often requires clarity, not depth, presence, not analysis. But clarity offers little for the intellect to chew on, so the mind returns to layered thoughts, convincing itself that because they feel deep, they must deserve attention, even as life waits for simpler, quieter decisions to be made. Not all questions deserve answers. Some exist to unsettle. The mind treats questions as problems waiting to be solved. From an early age, it is trained to believe that every question points toward an answer, and that finding it will restore balance. This belief makes uncertainty feel temporary, something to be endured only until resolution arrives. But some questions are not invitations to solve. They are confrontations meant to disturb stability. These questions expose limits. They challenge assumptions the mind depends on to function, pressing against areas where language fails and logic thins. Questions about meaning, identity, mortality, and existence often don't resolve because resolution would require false certainty. Their purpose is not clarity, but disruption. They unsettle because they remove the comfort of believing everything can be understood. The discomfort they create is intentional. These questions destabilize the narratives that keep life neatly organized. They interrupt routine thinking and force the mind to face ambiguity without defense. When the mind tries to answer them too quickly, it often reaches for shallow conclusions, not because they are true, but because the unease feels intolerable. Some questions exist to stretch awareness rather than complete it. Sitting with them builds tolerance for uncertainty and reveals how much of mental suffering comes from the demand for closure. The mind resists this exposure, interpreting it as danger. But the danger is not in the question. It is in the false answers rushed in to silence it. Unsettling questions are mirrors. They show the edges of understanding and the fragility of certainty. Their value lies not in resolution, but in the way they destabilize complacency. They force the mind to confront what it cannot master, reminding it that not every question is meant to be answered, and not every discomfort is a problem to eliminate. Insight without change becomes torture. Insight is often celebrated as progress, as if seeing clearly is enough to transform experience. In reality, insight without movement turns against the mind. When you understand a pattern but continue to live inside it, awareness sharpens pain instead of relieving it. You don't just suffer, you watch yourself suffer, knowing exactly why it's happening and feeling powerless to interrupt it. The mind expects insight to bring relief. It assumes that once something is seen, it should loosen its grip. When that doesn't happen, frustration grows. You recognize the trigger, predict the reaction, and still fall into it. Each repetition reinforces a sense of failure, not of character, but of agency. The loop becomes tighter because there is no longer ignorance to soften the impact. What makes this especially cruel is that insight removes excuses. You can no longer blame confusion or lack of awareness. You know the mechanism, the origin, the pattern, yet knowing does not equal control. Change requires risk, discomfort, and uncertainty, and the mind often resists those more than it resists pain. So it stays still while awareness keeps watching. This creates a split inside the self. One part observes, understands, and narrates. The other part repeats, reacts, and survives. The observer grows more critical as time passes, turning insight into a weapon. Each moment of repetition feels heavier because it is no longer unconscious. Without action, insight doesn't heal. It intensifies. It keeps the wound exposed without allowing it to close. Understanding becomes a spotlight with no exit, illuminating every flaw, every cycle, every missed opportunity. What was meant to free you instead tightens the chains because awareness demands movement, and when movement doesn't come, clarity becomes a constant reminder of being stuck. You are never arguing with others, only defending inner narratives. Arguments rarely unfold at the level they appear to. Words are exchanged, points are made, logic is presented, but beneath the surface, something more personal is being protected. When you argue, you are not safeguarding truth as much as you are safeguarding coherence. Each position you defend is tied to an internal story about who you are, how the world works, and why your past choices were justified. An opposing view feels threatening, not because it is wrong, but because it destabilizes the narrative holding your identity together. If their perspective holds weight, it forces you to reconsider your assumptions, and that reconsideration risks unraveling parts of yourself you rely on. The mind interprets this as danger. The argument becomes emotional, not because the topic matters, but because the narrative does. This is why facts rarely change minds. Evidence that contradicts a belief is filtered or attacked, not evaluated. Accepting it would mean revising the internal map that gives life continuity. The mind prioritizes internal consistency over external accuracy. Winning the argument becomes less about truth and more about preserving the story that allows you to move forward without doubt. The same mechanism operates on the other side. What you perceive as stubbornness or ignorance in others is the same defense you enact internally. Both sides are guarding narratives shaped by experience, fear, and identity. The clash is not between ideas, but between structures of meaning. Understanding this shifts how arguments are seen. They are not battles of intellect, but negotiations between stories. When someone argues intensely, they are signaling vulnerability, not certainty. They are defending something fragile inside themselves. And when you argue just as hard, you are doing the same, protecting an internal narrative that feels necessary for psychological stability, even if it is incomplete or flawed. Doubt is honesty without comfort. Doubt arises when the mind refuses to accept certainty it can no longer justify. It is not confusion, nor is it weakness. It is the moment honesty outweighs reassurance. Where belief offers stability, doubt offers accuracy at the cost of peace. It strips away comforting conclusions and leaves questions exposed, unanswered, and unresolved. Comfort depends on closure. The mind wants firm positions, clear explanations, and reliable narratives. Doubt disrupts this by revealing cracks in what once felt solid. It doesn't replace belief with a better story. It removes the story altogether. This absence feels unsettling because it forces the mind to sit with uncertainty without protection. What makes doubt difficult is that it offers no immediate reward. Belief provides direction and emotional relief. Doubt provides neither. It only offers alignment with what feels true in the moment, even if that truth is incomplete. This creates a psychological tension. You are no longer lying to yourself, but you are also no longer comforted by what you used to rely on. Doubt also isolates. Shared certainty binds people together, while uncertainty creates distance. Expressing doubt can feel like betrayal of group identity, tradition, or expectation. Many choose comfort over honesty for this reason. Doubt demands solitude, patience, and tolerance for ambiguity, qualities that are rarely rewarded. Yet doubt persists because it is rooted in integrity. It surfaces when the mind can no longer ignore contradictions. You don't choose doubt, it chooses you when belief stops fitting reality. It doesn't promise answers or resolution, it simply refuses false comfort. In that refusal, doubt becomes a quiet form of courage, standing in uncertainty not because it feels good, but because pretending would feel worse. The brain seeks patterns even where none exist, because chaos feels personal. The brain is wired to search for structure. Patterns provide predictability, and predictability creates a sense of safety. When events appear connected, even falsely, the mind feels oriented. Chaos, by contrast, feels hostile. Randomness suggests that anything can happen at any time for no reason, and the brain interprets this lack of order as a direct threat. When the mind cannot find patterns, it invents them. Coincidences become signs, outcomes become messages, and neutral events are woven into narratives. This isn't delusion as much as self-defense. A world governed by chance feels indifferent, and indifference feels like rejection. By creating patterns, the brain personalizes chaos, making it feel intentional rather than arbitrary. Personalized chaos is easier to tolerate than meaningless randomness. If something happened for a reason, even a painful one, it feels manageable. The brain prefers to believe it is being targeted or tested rather than accept that events unfold without regard for anyone at all. Pattern seeking restores a sense of relevance. It reassures the mind that it exists within a system, even if that system is imagined. This tendency explains why humans see meaning in suffering, fate in timing, and order in noise. It also explains paranoia, superstition, and overinterpretation. The brain would rather misread reality than sit with the terror of unpredictability. The search for patterns is not about accuracy, it is about emotional regulation. Chaos feels personal because the mind needs the world to respond. Patterns give the illusion of dialogue where none exists, turning an indifferent reality into something that feels at least aware, if not kind. The more you analyze life, the less it resembles something meant for you. Analysis pulls life apart. It examines causes, probabilities, patterns, and outcomes, reducing experience into mechanisms that can be understood but no longer felt the same way. As analysis deepens, the sense of personal significance begins to erode. Events stop feeling intentional and start feeling circumstantial. Joy becomes chemistry, success becomes timing, and suffering becomes statistical rather than meaningful. When life is not analyzed, it feels directed. Things happen for a reason, even if that reason is vague. Analysis removes that comfort. It exposes randomness, coincidence, and systemic forces that operate without regard for individual narratives. The idea that life is unfolding for you weakens when you see how easily outcomes could have been different under slightly altered conditions. This shift creates distance. You begin to observe yourself as part of a process rather than the center of a story. Choices feel less heroic and more constrained. Identity feels less chosen and more shaped by environment, history, and chance. What once felt like destiny starts to resemble momentum. The mind struggles with this because it wants to feel addressed by existence. It wants signs, meaning, and personal relevance. Analysis refuses to personalize. It treats life as neutral, indifferent, and unscripted. The more clearly you see how systems work, the harder it is to believe that they care. This does not make life meaningless, but it makes it impersonal. Meaning becomes something you project rather than something you receive. The feeling of being guided fades as understanding grows. Life stops feeling like a message and starts feeling like a process. The discomfort comes from realizing that the sense of being meant for was never guaranteed. It was a story that helped you move forward without questioning too deeply. Analysis strips away that story, leaving you face to face with a world that does not revolve around you, even as you continue to live at the center of your own awareness. Certainty is a psychological sedative. Certainty calms the mind not because it is true, but because it ends questioning. The moment something feels certain, mental tension drops, doubt fades, anxiety softens, and the mind can finally rest. This relief is powerful, which is why certainty is so seductive. It provides emotional comfort, not intellectual accuracy. The mind reaches for certainty the way the body reaches for sleep, out of exhaustion, not wisdom. Uncertainty keeps the nervous system alert. It demands attention, adaptation, and humility. Certainty shuts that system down. Once the mind decides it knows, it no longer needs to evaluate, explore, or remain open. This closure feels like peace, but it is closer to numbness. The discomfort hasn't been resolved. It has been quieted. This is why certainty often appears strongest in unstable environments. When reality feels unpredictable, people cling harder to rigid beliefs. The more chaotic life becomes, the more appealing simple answers feel. Certainty functions like a mental anesthetic, dulling the pain of not knowing by replacing it with confidence. The relief is immediate, but the cost is awareness. Certainty also protects identity. When beliefs feel fixed, the self feels stable. Questioning threatens both, so the mind defends certainty aggressively, mistaking challenge for attack. Facts that contradict certainty are rejected not because they are weak, but because they would reintroduce discomfort. The danger of certainty is not that it is wrong, but that it feels finished. Growth requires friction, and certainty removes it. Once sedated, the mind stops listening. It confuses stillness with understanding and comfort with truth. Certainty doesn't solve confusion, it quiets it. And in that quiet, curiosity fades, vulnerability is avoided, and the illusion of knowing replaces the effort of learning. Overthinking is a refusal to let moments pass unexamined. Overthinking begins as vigilance. The mind believes that every moment contains something that must be extracted, understood, or corrected. Nothing is allowed to simply happen and disappear. Each experience is paused, replayed, and dissected as if meaning might be lost if it isn't fully processed. The present is not lived, it is archived. This refusal to let moments pass comes from fear, not curiosity. The mind assumes that unexamined moments are dangerous, that missing an insight could lead to regret or loss of control. So it slows time internally, stretching seconds into internal debates and memories into endless analysis. What was once fleeting becomes permanent through repetition. Overthinking also creates the illusion of responsibility. By examining everything, the mind feels engaged and cautious. It mistakes scrutiny for wisdom and replay for preparation. Letting a moment go feels careless, as if something important were being abandoned. So the mind clings, revisiting tone, timing, intention, and outcome long after the moment has ended. This habit disconnects you from experience. While the mind is analyzing the past or rehearsing the future, the present continues unattended. Life becomes something you review rather than participate in. The richness of immediacy is replaced by the weight of interpretation. Moments were never meant to be held. They pass because passing is their nature. Overthinking resists this impermanence. It tries to preserve, correct, or perfect what is already gone. In doing so, it creates suffering from ordinary experience. The refusal to let moments pass unexamined is not a sign of depth, but of distrust in life's ability to unfold without constant supervision. The present is unbearable when the mind lives elsewhere. The present moment is simple, but simplicity offers nothing for a restless mind to hold on to. When attention drifts into memory or projection, the present begins to feel thin and inadequate. It becomes something to escape rather than inhabit. The discomfort does not come from the moment itself, but from the split created when the mind refuses to stay where the body is. When the mind lives in the past, the present is constantly compared to something that no longer exists. Regret, nostalgia, and replay distort perception, draining immediacy from what is happening now. When the mind lives in the future, the present feels like an obstacle to get through rather than a place to be. Anxiety turns each moment into a waiting room for something else. This displacement creates tension. The body remains grounded in sensation while the mind operates elsewhere, generating friction. The present begins to feel dull, suffocating, or unbearable because it cannot compete with imagined alternatives. The mind demands stimulation, meaning, or resolution, and the present offers only raw experience. The unbearable quality intensifies because the mind interprets stillness as emptiness. Without narrative, without anticipation or memory, the present exposes silence. That silence reveals how dependent the mind is on movement to feel alive. Being fully present strips away distraction and leaves awareness alone with itself. The tragedy is that nothing is wrong with the moment. What feels unbearable is the resistance to it. The mind escapes because it fears what happens when it stops traveling. The present becomes tolerable only when attention returns, not to improve it, but to stop abandoning it. When the mind lives elsewhere, the present feels like a prison. When it arrives, the walls dissolve into something that was never meant to be escaped. You don't want truth, you want control. The desire for truth is often framed as a noble pursuit, but beneath it lies a more practical motive. What the mind actually wants is control. Truth is appealing not because it is honest, but because it promises predictability. If something is understood, it feels manageable. If it can be explained, it feels less dangerous. The mind reaches for truth as a way to steady itself in an uncertain world. Uncertainty creates vulnerability. Not knowing what will happen, why it happened, or what it means leaves the mind exposed. Truth appears to offer protection against that exposure. It suggests that once reality is fully understood, surprises will diminish and mistakes can be avoided. This belief fuels constant analysis, fact-finding, and explanation-seeking, even in areas where certainty is impossible. The mind resists truths that reduce control. Information that destabilizes identity, challenges beliefs, or introduces unpredictability is often dismissed or rationalized away. Truth is welcomed selectively, accepted when it reinforces a sense of agency, rejected when it threatens it. This reveals that accuracy is secondary to emotional security. Control feels safer than honesty. A comforting narrative that offers direction is preferred over a complex truth that offers none. The mind doesn't seek reality as it is. It seeks reality arranged in a way that feels navigable. When truth fails to provide that structure, it is labeled impractical, negative, or unnecessary. What goes unacknowledged is that reality does not become safer when it is understood. Control is often an illusion created by explanation. Truth does not guarantee stability, and understanding does not prevent chaos. The pursuit of truth is frequently a pursuit of leverage, a way to feel less at the mercy of existence. What the mind truly wants is not to see clearly, but to feel like it can hold the reins, even when the reins are imagined. Awareness makes ignorance impossible, not peace. Awareness is often mistaken for an endpoint, as if seeing clearly will naturally produce calm. In reality, awareness does not soothe the mind, it sharpens it. What it removes is not suffering, but ignorance. Once awareness appears, the ability to look away disappears. You see patterns, motives, and consequences with clarity that cannot be reversed. Peace does not automatically follow. More often, discomfort intensifies. Ignorance offers insulation. It allows contradictions to coexist without friction and lets uncomfortable truths remain unexamined. Awareness strips that protection away. You recognize how habits repeat, how choices are constrained, and how often behavior is driven by fear rather than intention. This knowledge does not feel liberating at first. It feels heavy because it comes with responsibility. You can no longer claim you didn't know. Awareness also exposes limits. You become conscious not only of external forces, but of internal ones. Impulses, biases, and emotional triggers that operate independently of logic. Seeing them does not grant immediate control. Instead, it creates a gap between understanding and change. You watch yourself act against your better judgment, fully aware of the pattern, unable to stop it. This gap is unsettling. Peace requires acceptance, not perception. Awareness can point toward acceptance, but it does not guarantee it. In fact, awareness often disrupts peace by removing comforting illusions. You see the cost of avoidance, the fragility of certainty, and the impermanence of stability. Ignorance once softened those realities. Awareness is irreversible. Once the lens sharpens, it stays that way. What you gain is not serenity, but honesty. The mind must then learn to live without the shelter it once relied on. Peace, if it comes, arrives later, earned through restraint, humility, and patience. Awareness only ensures that returning to not knowing is no longer an option. The mind clings to suffering because it's familiar terrain. Suffering is not always held on to because it feels good, but because it feels known. The mind values familiarity over relief. When pain has been present long enough, it becomes a reference point, a landscape the mind has learned to navigate. Even when it hurts, it offers predictability. Letting go of suffering means stepping into uncertainty, and uncertainty feels more dangerous than pain you already understand. Familiar suffering provides identity. It shapes expectations, reactions, and self-concept. The mind knows how to function inside it, how to explain it, justify it, and anticipate its patterns. Removing it would require relearning how to exist without that framework. For many, that feels like erasing a part of themselves. Pain becomes woven into the story of who they are. The mind also mistrusts relief. When suffering lifts, there is a subtle anxiety that it won't last. The absence of pain feels unstable, like standing on unfamiliar ground without instructions. So the mind returns to old patterns, recreating discomfort because discomfort feels controllable. Known pain feels safer than unknown peace. This is why people sabotage moments of calm. Silence is filled with worry. Stability is disrupted with doubt. The mind scans for problems not because they exist, but because their absence feels suspicious. Suffering becomes proof that the system is working as expected. Letting go of familiar pain requires tolerating disorientation. It means giving up the map you've relied on, even if that map led through darkness. The mind resists this not out of weakness, but out of survival instinct. It would rather stay in terrain it knows how to endure than risk being unprepared in a place where old rules no longer apply. Understanding reality doesn't make it kinder. Understanding is often mistaken for comfort. The mind assumes that if it can clearly explain how reality works, the sharp edges will soften. But clarity does not negotiate with cruelty. Reality does not adjust its behavior once it is understood. It continues with the same indifference, now simply observed without illusion. When understanding deepens, expectations fall away. You see patterns of cause and effect, limitation, randomness, and inevitability. This knowledge removes hope built on misunderstanding. Pain no longer feels exceptional. It feels structural. Loss is no longer surprising. It is revealed as part of the system. This doesn't make experience gentler. It makes it more honest. Understanding strips away the fantasy that things happen for personal reasons. Reality is not punishing or rewarding. It is unfolding. For many, this realization feels cold. The idea that suffering isn't meaningful in itself, that it doesn't arrive with intent or lesson, destabilizes emotional coping mechanisms built on narrative. Clarity also eliminates bargaining. Once you understand the rules, you stop expecting exceptions. This can feel like resignation, but it is simply recognition. Reality does not become compassionate because it has been mapped. Knowing how fire burns does not make it warmer. The discomfort of understanding comes from its refusal to console. It offers no reassurance, no apology, no promise of fairness. It simply reveals what is. Kindness, if it exists, must come from humans, not from reality itself. Understanding reality removes false hope, not suffering. It replaces comforting myths with precision, leaving you face to face with a world that does not soften simply because you finally see it clearly. You can outgrow beliefs, but never fully escape their shadows. Beliefs do not disappear when they are abandoned. They fade, but they leave impressions behind, shaping perception long after conscious allegiance is withdrawn. Even when a belief is intellectually dismantled, its emotional residue remains. The mind may reject the idea, yet the reflex it created still activates, quietly influencing reactions, expectations, and fears. Beliefs are not just thoughts. They are repeated interpretations that trained the nervous system. They taught you what to anticipate, what to avoid, what to hope for, and what to fear. When you outgrow a belief, you stop endorsing its logic, but the body remembers the pattern. The shadow persists in instinct, hesitation, and automatic judgment. You no longer agree with the belief, yet you still feel its pull in moments of stress or uncertainty. This is why change feels incomplete. You understand differently, but you don't always respond differently. Old beliefs surface as doubt, guilt, or resistance even when you consciously know better. The mind assumes that awareness should erase influence, but conditioning does not dissolve on command. It weakens slowly through repetition, not realization. Shadows linger because beliefs once provided structure. They organized reality, gave meaning, and offered psychological safety. Removing them creates openness, but also instability. The mind may let go, but part of it misses the certainty that belief once supplied. In that absence, echoes form. Outgrowing a belief is not a clean break. It is a transition. You carry traces of what once guided you, even as you move beyond it. These traces do not mean failure or regression. They are evidence of depth, of time spent believing something strongly enough for it to leave a mark. You are not haunted by old beliefs. You are shaped by them. Their shadows don't control you, but they remind you that no belief leaves without leaving something behind. Thought creates distance between you and experience. Thought is meant to help navigate experience, but it often replaces it. The moment thinking steps in, the rawness of what is happening is filtered through interpretation. Instead of feeling, you analyze. Instead of noticing, you label. This creates a subtle separation between you and the moment itself. You are present physically, but mentally removed, watching life rather than inhabiting it. Experience unfolds in real time, but thought operates on delay. It pulls moments into memory or projects them into the future. When you think about what is happening, you are already one step removed from it. Joy becomes something to evaluate, pain becomes something to explain, and stillness becomes something to fill. Thought turns immediacy into commentary, replacing sensation with narration. This distance feels useful because it provides control. Thinking allows you to manage emotion, predict outcomes, and protect identity. But control comes at a cost. The more you think about experience, the less directly you encounter it. Moments lose texture, feelings flatten, even intense events become abstractions once the mind begins to frame them. Thought also fragments experience. Instead of a single unfolding moment, you get comparisons, judgments, and interpretations layered on top of one another. You ask whether the experience is good, meaningful, productive, or worth remembering. In doing so, you step out of the experience to observe it. The observer grows stronger while the participant fades. This is why moments of presence feel rare and fragile. They require thought to quiet, not expand. The mind resists this because silence feels like loss of control. Yet when thought loosens its grip, experience regains immediacy. Until then, thinking keeps you informed but distant, aware of life without fully touching it, understanding what is happening while standing just far enough away to never fully arrive. The need for meaning assumes the universe owes explanations. The search for meaning begins with an unspoken assumption that existence is supposed to make sense to us. The mind approaches life as if it were a puzzle designed to be solved, a story written with intention, or a system that owes coherence to those living inside it. Meaning becomes a demand, not a curiosity. When answers don't arrive, frustration follows. This need is rooted in discomfort with randomness. An unexplained event feels threatening because it resists control. Meaning restores order. It turns accidents into lessons, suffering into purpose, and chance into destiny. These interpretations don't come from the universe itself. They are imposed to protect the mind from chaos. The universe does not respond to why. It continues regardless of understanding. When meaning is expected, silence feels like neglect. The absence of explanation is interpreted as unfairness rather than neutrality. The mind asks, why this? Why me? Assuming there is an answer that has been withheld. This expectation creates suffering on top of pain. Not only did something happen, but it happened without justification. The insistence on meaning also shapes identity. People measure their worth by how well their life fits a narrative arc. When reality deviates, it feels like failure rather than variance. The universe, however, is not invested in personal stories. It offers conditions, not commentary. Letting go of the demand for meaning does not make life empty. It removes a false contract. Existence does not promise explanations. It does not guarantee clarity, fairness, or resolution. The need for meaning reveals more about the human desire for reassurance than about the structure of reality itself. What feels like a question may actually be a protest against indifference, spoken into a silence that was never meant to answer back. You can rationalize anything except existence itself. The mind is built to explain. It traces causes, constructs narratives, and assigns logic to events in order to feel oriented in the world. Almost everything can be rationalized if given enough context. Pain can be justified, loss reframed, behavior explained, and even contradiction smoothed over with the right story. Rationalization becomes the mind's primary tool for maintaining coherence. Existence itself resists this process. The fact that anything exists at all cannot be reduced to a satisfying explanation. Every attempt leads to deeper abstraction, not clarity. Causes point to prior causes, explanations to deeper mysteries, until the mind reaches a boundary it cannot cross. At that boundary, rationalization fails. This failure is unsettling because it exposes the limits of control. The mind wants a reason that resolves the question permanently, but existence offers none. It simply is. This simplicity feels offensive to a system designed to analyze. The absence of explanation feels like a flaw rather than a truth. People often replace this gap with belief, metaphor, or narrative. These don't solve the problem, they soothe it. They give the mind something to hold on to where logic cannot reach. Rationalization works everywhere else because it reduces uncertainty. With existence, uncertainty is foundational. The discomfort comes from realizing that understanding does not scale infinitely. The mind can map the world in extraordinary detail while remaining unable to explain why there is a world to map at all. This realization destabilizes intellectual confidence. You can justify actions, systems, and beliefs endlessly, but the raw fact of being here remains untouched by logic. Existence does not need permission or explanation. It persists outside rational comfort, immune to the stories designed to make it feel reasonable.